The morning Silas Rourke rode onto the Voss family farm, he didn't knock. He didn't need to. Men like Rourke hadn't knocked on a door in 20 years. He had 6 riders behind him, all of them armed, all of them watching the farmhouse windows, the way men watch for movement before they shoot. He climbed down from his horse slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he wants you to understand that he has nowhere urgent to be and you have nowhere safe to run. Margaret Voss came out onto the porch first. She was 61 years old and had lived on that land since before Wyoming was a territory. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at Rourke the way a woman looks at something she has already decided she doesn't trust. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "we've told you before. This land isn't for sale." Rourke smiled. It was the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Voss," he said pleasantly, "I'm not here to buy anything today." Pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and held it out toward her. She didn't move to take it, so he walked up the porch steps uninvited and set it down on the railing beside her hand. "That's a notice of water claim," he said, filed this morning with the county office. "As of today, the creek running through your eastern pasture legally belongs to the Rourke Mining and Land Company." He buttoned his coat. "You have 30 days to stop using it." Margaret stared at the paper. Her hands were shaking, though her face stayed still. "That creek has fed this farm for 30 years, she said quietly. 31, Rourke corrected her, as if the precision of it mattered. "I know the history, Mrs. Voss. I know it better than you do." He picked up his reins. 30 days. Then we'll talk about what the land itself is worth. He rode away without looking back, and somewhere 200 miles north, in a Wyoming kitchen that smelled like wood smoke and rendered fat and the slow despair of men who'd stopped expecting anything decent, Clara Voss was just starting to understand that running hadn't saved her family. It had only bought them time. If you've ever watched someone you love standing at the edge of losing everything and felt completely powerless to stop it, then this story was made for you. Before we go further, if these kinds of stories move you, if they make you feel something real, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end. Leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. And if it touched you, hit that like button. It means more than you know. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1878, and to the moment everything changed. Cookhouse at the Mercer Ranch was not a place a person came to feel better about the world. It was a low, dark building set back from the main house, with a roof that leaked in 2 places, and a stone hearth that had been throwing smoke wrong for so long that the walls had turned the color of old tobacco. 3 long tables ran the length of the room. The benches were uneven. One of the windows had been replaced with a piece of oilskin after the glass broke the previous winter, and nobody had gotten around to ordering more. The oilskin let in a gray, watery light that made everything look like it was happening underwater. 23 men ate their meals in that room every day. They ate without talking much. That was the first thing Clara noticed when she walked through the door on a Tuesday morning. In late October, her traveling trunk still sitting in the back of the wagon outside. Men who don't talk during meals are either too tired to bother or too beaten down to expect anything worth commenting on. These men had the look of the second kind. The second thing she noticed was the smell. It wasn't rot exactly. It was something more resigned than rot, the accumulated smell of food cooked carelessly, of grease that had never been properly cleaned from the iron, of coffee that had been boiled until it became something closer to medicine than drink. It was the smell of a place that had been asking to be cared for and had stopped asking. Clara set her bag on the nearest table and looked around. Behind the hearth, stirring something in a pot with the enthusiasm of a man serving a prison sentence, was a heavy-set cook named Dub Farley. He had been the ranch's cook for 4 months. Before that, he'd been a muleteer. Before that, nobody seemed to know. He was not a bad person. He was simply not a cook. He turned when he heard her come in and looked her up and down with the particular squint of a man trying to decide whether to be annoyed or relieved. "You the new hire," he said. "Clara Voss," she said. "And you must be the reason I have a job." Dub stared at her for a moment. Then he laughed a short, surprised sound, like a dog that didn't expect to find something funny. "That's fair," he said. "That's about fair. That was how it started." Elias Mercer had built his fortune the way most Wyoming ranchers built theirs in the 1870s through hard work, harder winters, a few calculated risks, and a willingness to outlast every problem until the problem gave up first. He owned 412 acres of grazing land, a main house with 8 rooms, a bunkhouse, 2 barns, a smokehouse, a stable with 17 horses, and approximately 3,000 head of cattle spread across the property. He was 38 years old and had the look of a man who had not slept past 5 o'clock in the morning in 20 years and didn't intend to start. He was not handsome in any soft sense of the word. His face had too much weather in it for that, and his jaw sat a little crooked from a break he'd taken at 22 and never had properly set. But he was solid, and he was serious, and when he walked into a room, the room noticed. His foreman was a lean, straight-backed man named Holt Greer, who had been with the ranch for 11 years and knew its rhythms, the way a musician knows a song, not just the notes, but where it breathes. Holt had been the one to tell Elias the truth about the cookhouse situation, because Holt was one of those rare men who believed that the truth, delivered plainly, was more useful than comfort delivered gently. The men are tired, Holt had said 3 weeks earlier. Tired men make mistakes, and mistakes with cattle at this time of year cost money. What do tired men need, Elias said. A decent meal, Holt said, and someone who gives a damn about feeding them one. Elias had put an advertisement in the Cheyenne paper the following week. Expected applications from 12 men. He received applications from 2 men, both unqualified, and 1 woman. He almost didn't read hers. He read it twice. Clara Voss had cooked for a hotel kitchen in Cheyenne for 4 years. Before that, she'd run the kitchen for a cattle operation twice the size of his near the Colorado border. She knew how to feed large numbers of working men, how to manage supply chains over long distances, how to preserve food through winter, and how to stretch a supply budget without sacrificing quality. Her references described her as formidably capable and not someone who accepts excuses. Elias showed the letter to Holt. Holt read it and said, "Hire her." "She's a woman," Elias said. Holt gave him a look that did not require words. Elias hired her. The first morning, Clara did not cook anything. She walked around the cookhouse for 45 minutes, opening every cabinet, inspecting every pot, pulling drawers out, and examining their contents, and writing in a small notebook she kept in her apron pocket. She ran her finger along surfaces and looked at what came up on her fingertip. She tasted the coffee just 1 sip and set the cup down, with an expression that suggested she was filing the experience away for future reference. Dub Farley watched her from the corner, unsure whether to feel judged. "You're not cooking?" he said after a while. "Not yet," she said. "Men'll be in for breakfast in an hour, I know." "They expect what they've been getting isn't what they should expect," Clara said, not unkindly. "I need to understand what I'm working with before I start working with it." She found 3 things that morning that she decided required immediate attention: the grease buildup in the iron pans, which had gone uncleaned so long that it was affecting the flavor of everything cooked in them, supply of salt pork that had turned and should have been discarded 2 weeks earlier, and a structural problem with the fireplace draft that was the source of the smoke issue. Scraped the pans. She threw out the salt pork. She went and found Elias Mercer. He was in the main house, going over supply ledgers at a desk that looked like it had been built to survive a siege. He glanced up when she came in, and then, because he was not expecting her, looked up again more carefully. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I need 3 things. Put down his pen. "I'm listening. New lard. Not the barrel you have in the storeroom, that one's contaminated. I need a fresh barrel, properly sealed, from town. I need a mason to look at the cookhouse chimney. Smoke draw is wrong, and it's been wrong for long enough that whoever built it probably knew and hoped nobody would notice. And I need a housekeeping budget." Elias looked at her steadily. "A what?" "A budget," she said, "for supplies, soap, linseed oil, 2 new iron skillets and a stock pot. Cleaning rags. I'll give you a full list by end of day. I want to know the number I'm working with before I order anything." Quiet for a moment, not because he was considering refusing, she could see he wasn't, but because he was recalibrating something. She could see it happen, like a man who expected a mule and got a horse instead, and was adjusting his expectations accordingly. "The chimney will take time," he said. "I know. In the meantime, I'll manage the smoke with airflow and fire placement. It won't be perfect, but the men won't be eating through a fog every morning." "Lard," he said. "Mason's supply budget." He picked up his pen. "I'll have Holt ride to town this afternoon." "Thank you," she said. Turned to leave. "Miss Voss," he said. She stopped. "The men are expecting breakfast," and he checked the clock on the mantel. 40 minutes. "They'll have it," she said. They did. It was not a remarkable breakfast by Clara's standards. She made do with what the supplies allowed: biscuits, fried eggs, a thick gravy from the remaining clean fat, and coffee that had been coaxed into something a human being could reasonably drink by the addition of proper ratios and a clean pot. But it was warm, it was sufficient, and it was served without the gray film that had been floating on the coffee for the past several weeks. The men ate in silence, the way they always did, but this silence was different. Clara stood near the hearth and watched it. The silence of men who are eating something that tastes like nothing is flat and defeated. The silence of men who are eating something that tastes like food is concentrated. Present, the fork moves with a little more purpose. The jaw works with a little more commitment, she noticed. One man young, couldn't have been more than 20, with a sunburned neck and the careful manners of someone, raised to be polite in kitchens, set his cup down and looked up. Coffee's different, he said. It's the same beans, Clara said. Just made properly. He considered this. Better, he said, and went back to eating. A man 3 seats down older, broad across the shoulders, with a gray mustache that he'd clearly had since, before it was fully warranted, said, without looking up, gravy doesn't have that taste today. What taste? The burned taste, he said. Used to taste burned every morning. That's because the pan wasn't clean, Clara said. The man with the gray mustache nodded, as if this was profound information. The young man with the sunburned neck looked like he wanted to laugh, but wasn't sure if it was allowed. Clara decided then that this room was going to be all right. By the end of the first week, the cookhouse had been cleaned from the ceiling to the floorboards. The lard arrived from town. The mason, a taciturn man named Pruitt, who spoke in single syllables and communicated mostly in sounds of assessment, spent an afternoon at the chimney and declared the problem fixable in a tone that suggested the original builder should feel professional shame. He came back the following Monday and fixed it. The smoke cleared. The men didn't say much about it. But the benches filled a few minutes earlier each morning, and after supper, a couple of them lingered over their coffee instead of heading straight for the bunkhouse. Small things. But Clara understood small things. Small things were usually the only honest language available. Elias watched this from a distance, the way he watched most things on his property, with attention, but without announcing the attention. He had built this ranch by noticing what worked and what didn't, and by making adjustments before problems became disasters. It was a habit that had served him well financially and less well personally, because the same detachment that made him a good rancher made him, by most accounts, a difficult man to know. He noticed that the men were eating better and acting accordingly. He noticed that Holt Greer had stopped wearing the particular expression of contained frustration that had been his resting face for the past several months. He noticed that 3 things that had been on his list of outstanding ranch problems had quietly ceased being problems without him being involved in solving them. All 3 of those things had something to do with the cookhouse, and the cookhouse had everything to do with Clara Voss. He found himself walking past it more often than the route required. He told himself it was on the way to the stable. The stable was not on the way to the cookhouse. He was aware of this. He continued to tell himself otherwise. The thing that surprised him was that she was not easy to talk to. He had expected easy. Women hired for service roles, in his experience, tended to calibrate themselves quickly to the dominant personality in a room, because it was simpler. Clara didn't do that. The second 2 week, he came to the cookhouse after the midday meal to discuss the supply ledger for winter, a topic he'd been planning to raise with her, since feeding 23 men through a Wyoming winter required serious advanced planning. He found her at the work table with the notebook open, already several columns of figures into a calculation he hadn't asked her to start. You're planning winter supply already, he said. You're 2 weeks behind where you should be for a proper order, she said, not looking up. If you want dry goods in before the first hard freeze, the order needs to go out this week. He sat down across from her. Holt usually handles the supply planning. Holt handles cattle supply, she said. He told me himself he's never been comfortable with kitchen numbers. He's been guessing. Elias looked at the notebook. The figures were meticulous line items for flour, salt, dried beans, smoked meat, lard, cornmeal, molasses, coffee, spices, and a dozen other things. Quantities calculated against head count and projected consumption rates, and a contingency column on the right side that she'd marked weather variance. Where did you learn to do this, he said. Clara looked up then. She had gray eyes, not cold gray, but the gray of a cloudy morning that hasn't decided yet whether it intends to storm. She looked at him for a moment in a way that was evaluating without being unfriendly. The hard way, she said, same as most things. He almost asked what she meant. He stopped himself because he recognized the tone. It was the tone of someone who had given an answer that was both true and complete and wasn't interested in being pressed further. He knew that tone. He used it himself regularly. He looked back at the notebook. All right, he said. What do you need from me to get the order sent this week? Slid the notebook across the table and tapped the bottom of the page. Sign that, she said, and tell me which supplier you use so I know who I'm dealing with. He signed it. Later, Holt found him standing by the stable, looking at nothing in particular, and said, Everything, all right, Elias. Fine, Elias said. Holt looked in the direction of the cookhouse and said nothing. Problem with Clara Voss, and Elias would not have admitted this to anyone, including himself, for several more weeks, was that she was the kind of person who made you see your own place clearly. Not in a harsh way, not in a way that felt like judgment, but in the way that a clean window reveals that the room you're sitting in has more dust in it than you'd noticed, because you'd stopped seeing what you'd grown used to. He had built something large here. He knew that. He had 400 acres and thousands of cattle, and a main house that had 8 rooms, 7 of which he never entered. He had enough men working for him that he rarely had to do anything himself, and enough money that most problems resolved themselves when properly funded. He had believed for a long time that this was what success looked like. Walking through the cookhouse on a Wednesday evening, watching his men eat real food and talk to each other, like people who expected tomorrow to be worth something, Elias began to feel, for the first time in a long time, something he had been missing, and he hadn't known what to call it until now. He didn't say this to anyone. He was not the kind of man who said things like that out loud. But he started finding reasons to be in the cookhouse. He came with ledger questions. He came with supply concerns. He came with questions about the men's preferences that he could just as easily have asked Holt. Clara answered him directly without ceremony, and occasionally looked at him with the expression of someone who could see exactly what he was doing and had decided to allow it on her own terms. You have an opinion about everything, he told her one evening. I have an opinion about things that matter, she said. She was kneading dough for the next morning's bread, and she didn't stop doing it. Not the same thing. Most people keep their opinions quieter around a man who signs their wages. Clara looked at him. Do you want someone who'll keep her opinions quiet? He thought about it. No, he said. Then we understand each other, she said, and went back to the dough. He left the cookhouse that night aware that his ranch had not been this interesting in years, and that the feeling gathering somewhere in his chest was not purely professional in nature, and that he was not sure what to do with either of those facts. He was still working it out, when 10 days later, a man named Silas Rourke rode through the front gate of the Mercer Ranch, and everything that had been quietly building suddenly came something a great deal more dangerous. Rourke arrived in the late afternoon in a black lacquered coach with 2 outriders, and an assistant who sat up front looking at everything with the careful blankness of a man paid to remember details. Coach was a statement. Everything about Rourke was a statement. He was 55 years old, broad-chested, and had the kind of money that had spent so long being large that it had stopped being remarkable to him and started being simply the weather he lived inside. He introduced himself to Elias in the main house with the easy charm of a man who has spent decades getting into rooms he wasn't entirely invited into. I've heard a great deal about your operation, Mr. Mercer, he said. Impressive what you've built out here. Thank you, Elias said carefully. In his experience, men who opened with compliments were building toward something else. I'm in the territory doing a bit of business, Rourke said. Land acquisitions primarily, water rights, always looking for opportunities. Wyoming has a lot of land, Elias said. It does, Rourke agreed. He accepted the glass of water Elias offered and looked around the room. I understand you've recently hired a new cook, a woman from Cheyenne. Elias went still. Not visibly, he was good at not going visibly still. But something behind his eyes became very quiet and very focused. Word travels, he said. In my line of work, Rourke said pleasantly, I make it a point to know who's who in a given area. He swirled the water in his glass. Miss Voss, I believe. Clara Voss. Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Rourke? Rourke looked at him with an expression that was almost admiring. You're a direct man, I respect that. He set the glass down. I'd simply like a word with her if you'd allow it. Old business, nothing that need concern you. The word allow sat wrong. Elias let the silence run for a moment before he answered. Miss Voss is an employee of this ranch, he said. If she wants to speak with you, that's her choice. I won't arrange the introduction. Rourke smiled. Of course, he said. Of course. He left shortly after, his coach rolling back out through the gate with the same deliberate ease with which it had arrived. Elias stood on the porch and watched it go, and felt something he hadn't expected, a specific, focused kind of unease that had nothing to do with business. He went straight to the cookhouse. Clara was at the fire, ladling the evening stew into the serving pot. She heard him come in and glanced over her shoulder. She saw his face. She set the ladle down. What happened, she said. A man named Silas Rourke came to the ranch today, Elias said. He asked to speak with you. The blood left Clara Voss's face so completely and so fast that Elias took a step toward her before he stopped himself. She turned back to the stew. Her hands, he noticed, were not quite steady. Picked up the ladle again and kept working, and when she spoke, Her voice was level, in the way that voices are level when a person is working very hard at keeping them that way. "What did you tell him?" she said. "I told him it was your choice whether to speak with him, that I wouldn't arrange it." A long pause. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name without the formality of Miss in front of it, and they both noticed. "Who is he?" She was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. Outside, one of the men called to another, across the yard, something ordinary and distant. "Trouble," she finally said, and then, because she was an honest woman who had been running from something long enough to know that running only works until it doesn't, "He's here because of my family, and because of what my family owns." She turned to look at him then, and the expression on her face was something he hadn't seen from her before. Not fear exactly, but the look of a person who has just understood that the thing they were afraid of has gotten closer than they realized and is now close enough to touch. "He's been trying to take our land for 3 years, she said. "Our farm back in Colorado. There's a creek runs through the eastern pasture. It feeds the whole valley. Rourke wants it. Water rights," Elias said. "Water rights," she said. "He's already gotten 3 other families out. Bribes, forged documents, intimidation. 2 of the families just left because they were scared. One family tried to fight, and their barn burned down 6 weeks later. No one could prove anything. Her jaw was set. My parents refused to sell. My father told Rourke to his face that he would die on that land before he signed a deed over to him." The fire popped. Clara looked at it. "I left," she said, "because I thought if I wasn't there, if I wasn't visible, he might let them alone. It was easier to go after people when their family was close by to threaten. Without me there to use as leverage." She stopped. "I thought it would help." "Did it?" She looked at him with those gray eyes. "He's here," she said simply. Elias stood in the warm, smoke-cleared cookhouse that he had watched this woman transform over the course of 3 weeks, through sheer force of competence and will, and he understood several things at once. That the woman standing in front of him had not come to Wyoming looking for anything other than safety for the people she loved. That she had built something real and steady here in his cookhouse, in his ranch, in the small community of men who ate at these tables. And that the thing she was afraid of had ridden through his gate that afternoon in a black lacquered coach and asked for her by name. "He won't come onto this property again," Elias said. Clara looked at him. "You don't know what he is," she said. "I know what he showed me today. That's enough." She studied him for a moment. The way she studied things, she was trying to understand carefully, and without the pretense of certainty. Then she picked up her ladle and went back to the stew. "The men will be in for supper in 10 minutes, she said. Elias nodded. He turned to go. At the door he stopped. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "You don't have to manage this alone," he said. "Whatever it is." She didn't answer right away. But something in the set of her shoulders changed. Just slightly, something that might have been, in a different person, in a different moment, the beginning of relief. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. He went back to the main house. And outside, somewhere in the distance, the sun was dropping behind the Wyoming ridgeline in shades of amber and copper and deep, complicated red, the kind of sunset that looks like a warning dressed as beauty, the kind the territory specialized in, the kind that came before hard weather. He didn't sleep that night. Elias lay on his back in the dark of the main house, staring at the ceiling he'd looked at for 11 years, and turned the afternoon over in his mind, the way a man turns a stone to find what's living under it. Rourke's face kept coming back to him, that particular brand of confident ease that had nothing to do with being relaxed and everything to do with being certain. Men who were genuinely at peace didn't arrive in black lacquered coaches with 2 outriders and an assistant paid to remember faces. Men who arrived like that were making a point. The money, the coach, the riders, all of it was language. All of it was saying the same thing. I can come anywhere. I can reach anything. The question Elias kept returning to was a simple one. Why here? Why now? If Rourke had been working on the Voss family for 3 years, slowly, methodically, the way a man with resources and patience works, when he's confident of the outcome, then something had changed. Clara had been in Wyoming for 4 months. If Rourke had wanted to use her as leverage, he'd had 4 months to find her. He hadn't moved until now, which meant something had shifted, something back in Colorado. He got up before 4 o'clock, dressed in the dark, and went out to the stable. The horses were warm and quiet. He stood there for a while, not doing anything in particular, just breathing the familiar smell of hay and animal and cold leather. It was the kind of place that settled his thinking when nothing else did. By the time he walked to the cookhouse at first light, he had decided 2 things. The first was that he needed more information about Silas Rourke than Clara had given him, because Clara had told him what she knew emotionally, and what he needed was the factual architecture underneath. The second was that he was going to involve Nathaniel Cross. Nathaniel Cross was a lawyer in Laramie who had, over the past decade, become the closest thing Elias Mercer had to a trusted advisor outside of Holt Greer. He was sharp-featured, meticulous, and had the disposition of a man who found most human behavior mildly but genuinely fascinating. He was not cheap. He was, however, thorough in a way that Elias had learned to value above almost any other professional quality. He'd send a letter that morning. Clara was already at the hearth when he came in, working the morning biscuits. She heard him come in and didn't turn around, but the set of her shoulders acknowledged him. "You're early," she said. "I couldn't sleep," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Neither could I. He sat down at the end of the work table, the spot he'd been gravitating to over the past several weeks, without making a formal decision about it. She brought coffee over without being asked, because she'd learned by the second week how he took it and what time he needed it, and set it down in front of him. "I want to know more about Rourke," he said. "All of it. Not just what you told me last night." Clara leaned against the work table and crossed her arms. She was wearing a gray work dress, and her hair was pinned back, not neatly, in the way of someone who had pinned it back quickly and efficiently, rather than carefully. There was a dusting of flour on her sleeve that she hadn't noticed. "How much do you want to know?" she said. "Everything you know that's useful," he said. "I'm not asking out of curiosity." She studied him for a moment. Then she pulled out a stool from under the work table and sat down facing him and began to talk. Silas Rourke had arrived in southern Colorado in 1873, which was the year Eclat was 22, and still living at home. He came in as a mining investor silver, primarily, though his operations had spread into copper and lead as the territory opened up. In the beginning, he was what he appeared to be, a wealthy man with capital to spend and a talent for finding productive ground. Creek that ran through the Voss eastern pasture fed 3 properties in that valley. The Voss farm, the Hartley sheep operation north of them, and a small corn farm owned by an elderly man named Decker who'd been there since before the war. The creek was not large, but it was consistent, fed by snowmelt from the high ground above. It ran clear and cold year-round, which in southern Colorado was not a small thing. For the farms in that valley, it was the difference between a marginal year and a good one. Rourke's mining operation was upstream. He had bought the land legally enough. But the mining process was dirty, and after 2 years, the downstream families began noticing changes in the water quality. Not catastrophic. Rourke was too careful for catastrophic, but consistent and cumulative, the kind of slow degradation that was hard to document and easy to dismiss. Her father, Willem Voss, had gone to the county land office. He had spoken to the local magistrate. He had written 2 letters to the territorial authority. Nothing happened. "That was the first time I understood how it worked," Clara said. Her voice was even, but it had the evenness of old anger that had been lived with so long it had become structural. "Money doesn't just buy things. It buys the people who are supposed to prevent you from buying things." In 1875, old Decker sold his corn farm and left the valley. The official story was that he wanted to be closer to his daughter in Denver. Clara's mother had visited him the week before he signed the deed and told Willem afterward that Decker had the look of a man who'd made a decision that scared him and wasn't willing to say why. The Hartley sheep operation went in 1876. Martin Hartley held out longer than anyone expected. He was a stubborn man with a large family and a fierce objection on principle. But a fence line dispute that tied up his grazing rights for 8 months nearly bankrupted him. And the fence line dispute had been initiated by a land claim that appeared out of nowhere from an office in Denver that turned out to have no physical address. "Paper companies," Clara said. "He uses paper companies. Names that don't correspond to real people, filed in offices that exist on paper and nowhere else. By the time you trace one, there are 3 more." Her family had watched both neighbors leave and understood what was coming. "My father said we weren't leaving," Clara said. "He said it at the dinner table one evening, and he said it the way a man says something that is already decided and doesn't require discussion." My mother didn't argue. She just stood up and started clearing the plates. "And you," Elias said. Clara looked at her hands. "I argued," she said. "I told him that principle was fine for men who could afford to lose. He told me that the principle was the only thing that made the land worth keeping." She said it without sentiment, but not without weight. "He was right," she said. "And I was also right. We were both right about different things, and it didn't matter, because we couldn't move him." In 1877, Rourke made his first direct offer to buy the Voss farm. It was generous, well above market value for the land itself, which told Willem immediately that Rourke wanted the water, not the acreage, and was willing to pay the premium to get it cleanly. Willem refused. 3 months later, A fence on the property's eastern boundary was destroyed overnight. A water pump was found disassembled. 2 of the farm's dogs disappeared. Small things, Clara said. Never anything you could bring to a marshal. Never anything that couldn't be attributed to weather or accident or kids being foolish. But your father knew, Elias said. We all knew, Clara said. Knowing and proving are different problems. The second offer came in early 1878. Lower than the first. Rourke was adjusting the message. Clara had been working in Cheyenne for 6 months by then, sending money home every month. Came back to the farm for 2 weeks that spring and sat at the kitchen table with her parents and looked at the books and understood that the farm was still viable barely, but genuinely as long as nothing else went wrong. Then a neighbor 20 miles south, a man named Pressler who ran cattle and had no connection to the water dispute whatsoever, told Willem over a fence post that a man had come to his property asking questions about the Voss family's finances. Specific questions, the kind that suggested access to records that weren't public. That's when I left again, Clara said, because I thought. She stopped, pressed her lips together. I thought that if I was visible, if Rourke knew, there was someone outside the family who could talk to authorities, who could make noise, he'd focus on me. And focus on me meant I was leverage against my parents. So by leaving, Elias said slowly, you thought you removed the leverage. Or at least complicated it, Clara said. A man standing alone with his wife on a farm is easier to intimidate than a family with someone on the outside who knows the full story. But Rourke found you anyway. Rourke found me anyway, she said. The morning light was coming stronger through the cookhouse windows. Outside, the ranch was waking up boots on gravel, the distant sound of the stable doors opening, someone calling a horse by name, the ordinary machinery of the day turning over. Clara stood and went back to the biscuits because they needed attending. There's something else, she said, her back to him. Elias waited. When Rourke came here yesterday, she said, he didn't come for business. Whatever he told you, whatever reason he gave, he came to tell me he knows where I am. That's all. It was a message. What kind of message? Pulled the biscuit tray and slid it toward the heat. Kind that says, you ran and it didn't help, and now I want you to think about what that means. She straightened up. He wants me scared enough to go home and convince my father to sign. Clara turned around and looked at him directly. No, she said, but I think he's about to stop asking. Nathaniel Cross arrived from Laramie 9 days later, on a Thursday, with a leather satchel, a 3-day beard, and the expression of a man who had read something troubling on the journey and had been thinking about it ever since. Elias met him at the gate and they walked to the main house, without much preliminary conversation, because Cross had long ago learned that Elias Mercer did not require social lubrication before a serious discussion, and he appreciated the economy of it. Tell me what you found, Elias said once they were inside. Cross opened the satchel. Tell me what you already know first, he said. So I don't waste time on the parts you've got, Elias told him. Everything Clara had said, organized and delivered plainly. Cross listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Elias respected about him. He was not a man who needed to demonstrate his intelligence by talking while other people were talking. When Elias finished, Cross sat back in his chair. The water claim, he said. That's the center of it. It's what he wants. It's more than what he wants, Cross said. If Rourke controls that water source, he controls the agricultural viability of that entire valley. He can sell access to it at whatever rate he likes, or he can restrict it entirely and force the remaining land values down until he can acquire them cheaply. It's not just one farm. It's the beginning of a land consolidation strategy that's been used in 3 other counties in this territory in the past 4 years. Elias looked at him. You've seen this before. I've seen the shape of it, Cross said. Different names, same structure. Paper companies, manufactured legal disputes, corrupt county officials, slow pressure applied over time until the people being pressured can't afford to keep fighting. He pulled a sheet of paper from his satchel. Rourke's legal entities are layered. I found 6 shell companies with Colorado filings that traced back to a holding company registered in St. Louis. The St. Louis company is owned by a trust. The trust's beneficiary isn't named in the public filing, but 3 of the company officers appear in connection with Rourke's named operations. Can you prove it? Not yet, Cross said. What I have is a pattern. Pattern is the beginning of a proof, not the proof itself. What do we need? Cross looked at him. Documents, he said. Internal correspondence. Deed filings that show the forged instruments. Payment records between Rourke and the county officials who processed those filings. That kind of material doesn't exist in public records. It exists in Rourke's private records, or in the possession of people who were involved and have since developed a conscience or a reason to talk. Witnesses, Elias said. Witnesses, Cross confirmed. People who took money or signed documents under duress and are now living with it. He closed the satchel. Those people are afraid, which is why nobody's been able to touch him. Elias was quiet for a moment. Start with the witnesses, he said. Whatever it costs to find them and get them talking, that's what we spend. Cross looked at him with a mild expression that contained, underneath it, something that might have been respect. This is going to make Rourke very unhappy, he said. Good, Elias said. They didn't tell Clara about Cross's findings all at once. Elias told her that he'd brought in a lawyer to look at the situation, that there were legal avenues worth pursuing, and that it would take time. He told her this carefully, without overpromising, because he'd learned enough about her in 6 weeks to know that she didn't want reassurance, she wanted accuracy. She listened, and then she said, "What do you need from me?" "Names," he said. "Anyone your family dealt with who you think might have been involved, or might have seen something. Neighbors who left, officials who handled filings. Anyone who seemed to know more than they should have." She wrote 6 names in her notebook, tore the page out, and handed it to him. He sent the page to Cross that afternoon. What he didn't tell her was that 2 days after Rourke's visit to the ranch, Holt Greer had reported finding a rider on the property's eastern fence line, a man who wasn't one of theirs, watching the main house from a distance before turning and riding off when he realized he'd been spotted. Elias had doubled the night watch without announcing the reason. He wasn't ready to tell Clara that she was being observed. She was already managing enough, but the rider on the fence line had clarified something for him that he'd been uncertain about before. Rourke wasn't waiting. Whatever he was building toward, he was already building it. The timeline was not going to be comfortable. It was a Saturday evening, the 4th week since Rourke's visit, when Clara found the herb garden. It was not a garden yet, just a patch of ground beside the south wall of the cookhouse, where the soil got afternoon sun and was, by the standards of the surrounding dirt, comparatively hospitable. She'd been looking at it for 3 weeks. She'd been thinking about rosemary and sage, and whether time would manage the elevation, and whether there was any reasonable hope of parsley before the ground went hard. She was on her knees in the dirt, turning the soil with a hand trowel, when Elias came around the corner of the cookhouse and stopped. She looked up. She had dirt on her hands and on the knee of her dress, and she looked, in that moment, like someone who had forgotten for a few minutes to be careful. "Herb garden," she said before he could ask. "For the cookhouse?" "For the food," she said. "Fresh herbs in winter make a difference." Not a dramatic one, but a real one. He looked at the patch of ground. It was not a promising piece of real estate. "That soil is hard," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm working on it." He crouched down across from her. She handed him the trowel without being asked, in the practical way she did things, and he turned a row of soil while she broke up the clods behind him. They worked in silence for a while. Not an awkward silence, the other kind. Kind that happens between people who have gotten comfortable enough with each other that quiet doesn't require filling. "My mother had a kitchen garden," Clara said after a while. He kept working. "In Colorado," she said. "At the farmhouse, same idea, south-facing, afternoon sun. She grew everything. Herbs, tomatoes when the season allowed, a row of onions that she was unreasonably proud of." A pause. "I used to sit on the fence and watch her work it when I was small. I thought she was doing something very simple. I was wrong." Elias looked at her. She was looking at the soil. "She was making the house feel like a home," she said. "That's what gardens do. It's got nothing to do with the plants." He sat back on his heels and thought about the 7 rooms he never entered. "I haven't had a garden on this property in 11 years, he said. "Since before I built the main house." "Why not?" He thought about it honestly. "I never saw the point," he said. "It seemed like an addition. Something decorative." "It's not decorative," Clara said. "It's a declaration." She pulled a stubborn root and examined it. "It says I intend to be here. I'm planning for next season." The evening was cooling. The light had gone gold and low, the way Wyoming evenings did before they went dark quickly. "Do you?" he asked. "Do I what?" "Intend to be here," he said. "Next season." She held his gaze for a moment. It was the kind of question that had more inside it than its surface, and they both understood that, and neither of them was quite willing to address the more that was inside it directly. "I'll stay as long as I'm needed," she said finally. "That's not what I asked," he said quietly. She went back to the soil. "No," she said, "it isn't." She didn't answer the actual question. He didn't push, but something between them had shifted, slightly impermanently, the way ground shifts after it's been worked, not dramatic, just different from before. Cross came back 3 weeks after that, with news that was good and bad, in the particular way that real progress always is. It moved things forward and it made them more dangerous at the same time. He had found 2 witnesses. The first was a former county clerk named Adler, who had processed 3 of Rourke's water claim filings in 1000 876, and had since left the county office and moved to a town 40 miles east, where he was working in a general store and appearing, by Cross's description, to be a man who was not sleeping well. The second was a woman named Bertie Callahan, the widow of a rancher who had sold his water rights to one of Rourke's shell companies under what she described as significant duress. Her husband had died the following year. She was not willing to say she connected the two events. She was willing to talk, and what she had to say about the coercive tactics used against her husband was detailed and specific and consistent with everything Clara had described. Neither of them will go on record yet, Cross said. He was sitting across from Elias and Clara. Both this time, Elias had asked Clara to be present, and she'd come with her notebook. But they're talking, and when people start talking, other people start wondering if they're the only ones who've been sitting on something. How long before they'll commit, Elias said. Hard to say. Adler is the key. He has the clearest documented involvement. He signed the filings. If he testifies, the paper trail becomes an evidentiary chain rather than a pattern of circumstantial evidence. What does he need? Clara said. Cross looked at her. Courage, he said, and the belief that the people around him won't collapse before the case is made. Clara wrote something in her notebook. Cross noticed and didn't comment. There's something else, Cross said. He looked at Elias. I heard something in Laramie before I left. Rourke's been asking about you specifically, about your financial position, your creditors, your relationships with the territorial authority. A pause. He's building a picture. Of what? Of how much pressure it would take to make you uncomfortable enough to distance yourself from this situation. Elias was quiet for a moment. Did he find anything useful? He said. Your finances are sound, Cross said. Your relationships in the territory are good. You're not an easy target. He leaned forward slightly. But he doesn't need an easy target. He needs to convince you that the cost of continuing is higher than the cost of stepping away. Tell me what the cost of continuing looks like, Elias said. Cross was direct because he always was. He could go after your cattle contracts. If he has relationships with enough buyers, and he may. Because he's been building connections in this territory for 2 years, he could make your next selling season complicated. He could challenge your land surveys, initiate spurious legal claims, apply pressure to your suppliers. None of it would destroy you. All of it would cost you time and money and attention. All of it would cost less than letting him win, Elias said. Cross looked at him with that mild expression again. I thought that's what you'd say, he said. Clara had been quiet through this last exchange. Elias glanced at her. She was looking at the table, and the look on her face was the one she got when she was thinking about something she didn't want to say. Say it, Elias said. She looked up. He's going to come after the ranch, she said. Not because he needs to, because he wants to demonstrate that there's no safe place to stand against him. She met his eyes. He doesn't just want the water rights anymore. He wants to make an example. Of anyone who helps my family, she said. If you pay a price for standing beside us, then no one else will try. Her voice was steady, but her hands were flat on the table. That's how he's operated from the beginning. It's never just about the land. It's about making resistance look like suicide. The room was quiet. Elias looked at Cross. What do we do next? We find Rourke's records, Cross said. If there are written orders, payment ledgers, correspondence connecting him directly to the acts of intimidation, not just the paper companies, but the actual instructions, then we have something a federal marshal can use. Without it, we have a pattern and 2 witnesses who are still deciding whether they're brave enough. Where would those records be? If he's as careful as he appears, somewhere that isn't obviously connected to him, Cross said. Trusted associate, a lawyer he uses a vault. He paused. Or possibly with someone inside his operation who kept records as insurance. Insurance against what? Clara said. Against being the one who goes down if it ever falls apart, Cross said simply. Rourke is careful, but the people who work for him are careful too in a different direction. Clara looked at Elias. He looked back at her. And something passed between them that was not spoken, but was as clear as anything either of them could have said out loud. That they were already in this, both of them, and the only direction available was forward. The night the barn burned, Elias was in the main house going over the winter supply ledger when he smelled the smoke. It was a particular smell, not the clean smoke of a wood fire, but something heavier and darker, with a chemical edge that his body understood before his mind caught up to it. He was out the door and running before the first shout went up from the bunkhouse. It was the large barn, the one that held the hay stores, the equipment, and 8 of the stabled horses. The fire had started on the eastern wall. He could see the origin point from the yard, the place where the burn was most advanced, where the boards had gone from orange to black, while everything else was still fighting. Someone had started it at the base of the wall, low and deliberate, with something that burned hot and fast. The men came out of the bunkhouse running. Holt Greer was already shouting instructions: get the horses, water lines, bucket chain from the well. 2 men went for the horses, 3 went for water. The fire had a 20-minute head start minimum. In a dry October, that was a great deal. They saved 5 of the 8 horses. The hay stores were gone. The equipment, a large portion of it, the plows, the winching gear, the feed grinders was gone with them. The barn itself was a blackened frame by 3 in the morning, standing against the dark sky like a set of bad teeth. Elias stood in the yard and looked at it. Clara came and stood beside him. She had come out when she heard the shouting and spent the night helping hauling water, managing the men who came back singed and coughing, making coffee when the fire was down to embers, and the immediate crisis had passed to the long, exhausted aftermath. The eastern wall, she said quietly, where it started. Someone said it, he said, yes. Neither of them said Rourke's name. They didn't need to. Holt came up beside them. He had a burn on his right forearm that he hadn't mentioned and didn't intend to mention, though Clara had already seen it and was going to deal with it, whether he wanted her to or not. What do you want to do? Holt said. He was asking Elias, but he looked at both of them. Elias looked at the ruined barn for a long moment. The frame was still standing, smoking at the joints. Stone foundation was intact. It could be rebuilt. It would cost money and time and the disruption of a winter's work, and it could be rebuilt. We start clearing the site in the morning, Elias said. Get the stone surveyed by the end of the week. I want the frame going up before the ground freezes. Holt nodded, and Elias said, yeah, double the watch on every building. Rotate shifts. I want someone awake and walking the perimeter from sundown to sunup. Done, Holt said. He walked away toward the remaining men. Clara was looking at Elias with an expression he couldn't fully read. It had something in it that might have been guilt and something else that was not. This is because of me, she said. This is because of Rourke, Elias said. No, he said. His voice was not harsh, but it was final. Don't take that on. He made the choice to send someone to my property with fire. That's on him, not on you. She was quiet. I'm not walking away from this, he said. Not from the legal case. Not from you. He said the last word and let it stand where it fell and didn't qualify it because he'd learned by now that Clara respected directness more than careful framing. She looked at the burned barn. She looked at him. Something shifted in her face, not soft exactly, but open. The way a window looks when someone has decided to raise the sash. All right, she said. It was not a large word, but the way she said it meant more than agreement. It meant, I am no longer carrying this alone, and I am going to let myself believe that. Elias nodded. They stood together in the dark and the fading smoke while the ranch settled around them, damaged and intact and still standing, and neither of them spoke for a long time. The barn frame went up in 11 days. It was not a comfortable 11 days. The ground was cold, and the men were tired, and the lumber that came from town was not entirely the quality Elias had specified, because the mill had been working a backlog, and Elias was not willing to wait for a second shipment. Holt managed the construction with his usual economy of expression, directing men and materials with the quiet authority of someone who had learned that most problems responded better to clear instruction than to volume. By the end of the second week, the frame stood solid against the November sky, raw and pale as new bone, and the men who had watched the old barn burn looked at it with the particular satisfaction of people who have answered a bad thing with work. Elias paid for the lumber, the labor, and the replacement equipment out of his own accounts without discussion. He did not mention the cost to anyone. The money was there and the need was real, and that was the entirety of the calculation as far as he was concerned. What he did not say out loud, what he turned over privately in the early mornings, when he walked the property before anyone else was moving, was that the barn had not been the point. The barn was a message, and messages were not about the thing destroyed. They were about what the destruction was supposed to produce. Rourke had burned the barn to produce fear, or withdrawal, or the particular exhaustion that comes from watching something you built reduced to char. He had miscalculated on all 3 counts. But Elias was under no illusion that miscalculation would stop him. It would only redirect him. Cross sent word from Laramie at the end of the first week of November. Adler, the former county clerk, had agreed to a meeting. Not a formal deposition, not yet, but a conversation. Cross described it in his letter with careful precision. Adler was willing to talk in a room with Cross and one other person he trusted. He was not willing to go on record until he understood the full scope of what was being built. He was, in Cross's words, a man standing at the edge of a decision that terrified him, looking for a reason to jump. Elias rode to Laramie. He did not tell Clara where he was going. He told Holt because Holt needed to know, and he told Holt to keep the watch rotations as they were, and to send word immediately if anything changed on the property. Then he saddled the gray mare that he rode when he needed to cover distance efficiently and left before first light on a Wednesday. The ride was cold and long and gave him time to think, which was both useful and uncomfortable. Thought about the legal strategy, which was straightforward enough in principle and complicated in execution. He thought about the witnesses, Adler and Bertie Callahan, and what it would take to move them from conversation to commitment. He thought about Clara's 6 names in her notebook, and the things she'd told him about the valley in Colorado and the creek that had started all of it. He thought about Clara, not in the way he'd been allowing himself to think about her carefully, and at the edges, the way you look at something bright without looking directly at it. He thought about her honestly, about the fact that she'd spent 4 months building something real on his ranch, not just in the cookhouse, but in the way the men ate and talked and moved through their days, in the small herb garden beside the south wall that had gone dormant now with the cold but would come back in spring, in the atmosphere of the place, which had acquired something it hadn't had before her arrival, and which he was not sure he could have named before now. He thought about the herb garden and what she'd said. It says, "I intend to be here. I'm planning for next season." He wanted her to be here next season. He wanted more than that, and he knew it. He was going to have to stop not saying it at some point. The time for that particular conversation was not now, while Rourke was still loose, and the case was still a pattern without a proof. First things first. He'd learned that from 11 years of building something from open ground, you lay the foundation before you put up the walls. Adler was a small man, thin-shouldered, with the hands of someone who had spent years behind a desk, and the eyes of someone who hadn't slept through a full night in months. He met Elias and Cross in the back room of a lawyer's office in Laramie, not Cross's office, a colleague's, chosen for the neutrality of it. He sat across the table with a cup of coffee he didn't drink, and looked at both of them with the expression of a man who had rehearsed this conversation many times in his own head, and was now discovering that the actual version was different from any of the rehearsals. "I signed the filings," he said, almost immediately, as if he needed to get it out before anything else could happen. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I was ignorant of what I was doing." "All right," Elias said. "I knew they were irregular," Adler said. The water claim documentation was thinner than it should have been. There were gaps in the chain of title that I would have caught and flagged under normal circumstances. I didn't flag them. He looked at his coffee. "I was told not to." "By whom?" Cross said. "The county recorder at the time," Adler said. "A man named Fitch. He came to me directly in private and told me that these particular filings were to be processed without question." A pause. "He told me that Mr. Rourke had significant interests in the county, and that facilitating his business was a matter of professional practicality." "And you understood what that meant?" Cross said. "I understood that Fitch had been receiving payments from somewhere," Adler said flatly. "I didn't know the specifics. I didn't ask. I processed the filings." He looked up. "Fitch left the county office 18 months ago. He's in Denver now, I believe, a private legal practice." Cross made a note. "There were 3 water claim filings," Adler continued. 2 in 1,876, 1 in the spring of 1,877. All 3 involved properties in the Southern Valley. All 3 displaced existing water usage by downstream farms." He stopped. After the third one, a family named Voss filed a formal objection. Elias kept his face still. "The objection was dismissed at the county level," Adler said. "I don't know by whom specifically, but I know the dismissal was processed inside of 48 hours. Not normal procedure. A formal objection takes weeks under normal procedure." He was quiet for a moment. "I kept copies of the original filings, both the versions I received and the versions that were entered into the record." He looked at them both. "They're not the same documents." Cross put his pen down slowly. "You have copies of both versions." "I have copies of both versions," Adler said. "I kept them because," he stopped, looked at the table, "because I knew that someday this conversation was going to happen. I didn't know if it would happen soon or late, or whether I'd be alive for it. But I kept them." The room was quiet for a moment. "Where are they?" Elias said. "With someone I trust," Adler said. "Not here. Not in Laramie." He looked at Elias directly for the first time since the conversation started. "I'll give them to you when I know what you're doing with them." "We're building a federal case," Cross said. "Documents showing altered filings combined with testimony from witnesses who can speak to the coercive tactics." "I know what a federal case looks like," Adler said quietly. "What I need to know is whether the people building it are going to be standing when it gets to that point." because the last person who tried to make noise about Rourke's operations in that county had a very bad experience and very few people willing to be seen with him afterward. He looked at Elias again. It was the look of a man assessing specifically whether the person across from him was the kind who stays. Elias met it. "I've already had one building burned," he said. "I rebuilt it." He said it without drama, the way a person states a fact they've fully processed. "You'll have people standing." Adler looked at him for a long moment. "All right," he said. Clara found out about the meeting from Cross, not from Elias, which meant she found out after the fact, and when Elias came back from Laramie she was in the cookhouse, and she looked at him with an expression that was not quite anger, but was something adjacent to it, the particular expression of a woman who has been kept out of a room, concerned her, and is deciding how to respond to that. "You went to meet Adler," she said. "I did, without telling me." "I told you I was going to Laramie," he said. "I didn't tell you specifically why." "Because you thought I'd want to come." "Because I thought you would want to come." "Yes," he said. "And because I thought it was better for Adler to meet me first, without the Voss name in the room, so he could make his decision about whether to talk without feeling like he was being observed by the person with the most at stake." She looked at him. She was deciding whether that reasoning was sound, or whether it was rationalization, and he could see her working it out. "Was he going to talk regardless?" she said. "I don't know," Elias said honestly. "Closer to the edge than I expected. He's been carrying this for 2 years. Pause. "What did he have?" Elias told her. "The duplicate documents, the altered filings, the forged water claims." When he got to the part about the formal objection being dismissed in 48 hours, Clara went very still. She turned back to the pot she'd been stirring and then stopped stirring, and just stood there with the spoon in her hand and her back to him. "My father filed that objection," she said. "I know. He rode to the county office himself. He spent 2 days putting together the documentation." Thought. Her voice had gone careful and controlled in the way that meant it needed to be. Thought if he went through the proper channels, if he did everything correctly. "I know," Elias said. She set the spoon down, turned around. Her eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible. "Do the documents prove it was forged?" she said. "The 2 versions side by side prove something was changed," he said. "Cross says it's strong. Not enough alone, but combined with testimony from Adler and Mrs. Callahan, and whatever else we can find." He paused. "It's real, Clara. It's an actual thing we can take somewhere." She nodded. She was gathering herself, the way she always did, not suppressing the feeling, but sorting it into a place where it would keep until she had time for it properly. "What do we need next?" she said. "The original records," he said. "Whatever your father documented over the years, his own copies, his correspondence, anything he kept. And if there are people in that valley who experienced the same tactics, who haven't yet spoken to anyone, Cross needs their names." "I can write to my mother," she said. "Yes." She turned back to the pot, picked up the spoon. Then she stopped again and said, without turning around, "You should have told me you were going." "Yes," he said, "I should have." She nodded once, accepting it. "Don't do it again," she said. "I won't," he said. She went back to cooking. The matter was closed. It was, he reflected, one of the things he'd come to understand about her. She did not hold things longer than they needed to be held. She had enough to carry already. The letter from Clara's mother arrived on a Friday, 3 weeks into November. Clara was alone in the cookhouse when it came, the midday meal finished and the men back to work, and she read it standing at the work table with the paper flat on the wood and her hands on either side of it. Elias found her there 20 minutes later, still standing in the same position, the letter still flat on the table. He came in and looked at her face and felt the bottom drop out of something. "What happened?" he said. "My father," she said. Her voice was steady but thin, like a wire pulled too tight. "He was injured. 3 weeks ago in the mine access road near the property, a wagon accident, they're calling it. She stopped, started again. He was pinned under the wagon for 2 hours before anyone found him. His leg is broken in 2 places. He has internal injuries. The doctor in town isn't sure. She couldn't finish it." Elias crossed the room and stood beside her, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel that there was someone there. "Is he alive?" he said. "He was when my mother wrote this," Clara said. "This letter took 3 weeks to reach me." That means she looked up. "I don't know what it means now. I don't know what's happened in 3 weeks." She was holding herself very still in the way that people hold themselves when they're afraid that movement will break something. "A wagon accident," Elias said carefully. Clara's jaw tightened. "There are no wagon accidents on that road," she said. "My father has driven that road for 30 years. He knows every rock on it." The word accident hung in the air between them with all the weight of what it was not. Elias looked at the letter. He looked at Clara. He thought about Rourke's coach, rolling back out through his gate in October. and the rider on the fence line that Holt had spotted, and the burned barn, and the systematic, patient, methodical way a man with resources and no conscience moved toward what he wanted. Thought about how wrong he'd been to assume the pressure would stay on the ranch. "I have to go," Clara said. Her voice had resolved into something definite. "I have to go to Colorado." "Yes," he said. "We leave in the morning." She turned to look at him. "Don't," he said. Not unkindly. "Don't tell me it's not my problem or that I should stay with the ranch. Holt can manage the ranch. He's been managing it longer than either of us has been talking to each other." He met her eyes. "I'm not letting you ride 300 miles alone into Rourke's territory." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked away, and something in her face shifted, not weakness, but the specific expression of someone allowing themselves to be less alone than they've been for a very long time. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded. "Right to Cross tonight. Tell him what happened. He needs to know the pressure has moved to Colorado and adjust accordingly." He paused. "And write to your mother. Tell her you're coming." They rode south with two of Holt's most reliable men, steady, capable, not given to conversation, and made the journey in 4 days, pushing hard but not recklessly. The landscape changed as they dropped in elevation, the high Wyoming grasslands giving way to the rougher terrain of the Colorado approaches, the mountains on the western horizon shifting from blue-white to brown-gray as the season advanced. Clara did not talk much on the ride. She was somewhere inside herself, working through something he couldn't see. He didn't push. He'd learned to read when she needed to be left alone inside her own head, and when she needed someone to pull her back from it, and this was the first kind. They arrived at the Voss farm on a Thursday afternoon. The farmhouse was smaller than Elias had pictured it. He'd built a version of it in his mind from Clara's descriptions, and he'd made it larger and more settled-looking than it was. It was a modest place, well-maintained but plainly built, with the look of a structure that had been added to over the years as need and money allowed, rather than designed all at once. Herb garden his mind had imagined at the back was there dormant now, cut back for winter, but the bed was clear and edged, the kind of garden tended by someone who expects it to come back in spring. Margaret Voss came out of the house before they'd fully dismounted. She was a small, straight-backed woman with Clara's gray eyes and a composure so complete it was almost frightening. She embraced Clara without a word, briefly and hard, then stepped back and looked at Elias with an assessing look that Clara had clearly inherited. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "Clara wrote to me about you." "Mrs. Voss," he said. "I'm sorry it's under these circumstances." "Come inside," she said. "He's awake today. He'll want to see you." Willem Voss was propped up in the bed in the front room. The room had been rearranged to serve as a sick room. Told Elias something about how long the recovery was expected to take with a leg immobilized on a board, and a bruising across his torso that was visible at the collar of his nightshirt, even from the doorway. He was a large man, or had been the injury, and 3 weeks of bed rest had taken something from the density of him. But his eyes were clear and direct, and when Clara came through the door, his face changed in the way that faces change when something essential returns to the room. She sat on the edge of the bed and took his hand and didn't say anything for a moment. "You look tired," he said. His voice was rough but steady. "I rode 300 miles in 4 days," she said. He said. He looked at Elias, who was standing in the doorway. "You're the rancher, Elias Mercer," Elias said. "Clara says you've been helping," Willem said. He was looking at Elias, the way men of his generation looked at another man's character directly, without apology for the examination. "We've been building a legal case," Elias said. "A lawyer named Cross is managing it from Laramie. We have witnesses and documents. It's moving." "Moving," Willem said. The word carried a weight of someone who had watched things fail to move for 3 years. "It was an accident," Clara said, not a question, but the way she said it made clear she already knew the answer. Willem's jaw set. "The wheel came off the wagon on the south road," he said. "A wheel I checked 2 days before. A wheel that was sound when I checked it." He looked at the ceiling. The pin was missing, not loose. Missing, the room was quiet. "Papa," Clara said. "I know," he said. He squeezed her hand. "I know." He turned his head and looked at Elias again. There was something working in his face, something he was deciding about. "There's something I haven't told anyone," Willem said. He said it to Clara, but he looked at both of them. "Not your mother. Not the marshal who came to ask about the accident." His voice dropped. 3 months ago, I was in Cheyenne on supply business. I ran into a man named Garrett who used to work in Rourke's Denver office. We'd met once before, years ago in the valley. He pulled me aside in the street, stopped, breathed carefully. He told me that Rourke had been keeping private records, Willem said. Everything, the bribes, the forged documents, the instructions he gave to the men who handled the intimidation. Garrett said Rourke kept them deliberately, Insurance, he called it. Rourke kept records on everyone who worked for him, so that if anyone ever turned on him, he could pull them down too. Where are the records? Elias said. Garrett didn't know exactly, Willem said. He said they weren't in Rourke's main office. He said Rourke moved them periodically, kept them somewhere separate. He paused. But Garrett had seen a bank receipt in Rourke's papers once, years ago. A vault receipt from the First Territorial Bank in Cheyenne. Elias went very still. He copied it, Willem said. Zeit. Garrett copied the receipt number from memory. He gave it to me. His eyes moved to Clara. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you carrying it. If Rourke suspected someone had that information. He stopped, looked at the ceiling again. Maybe I was wrong about that. Where's the copy? Clara said. In the bank in town, Willem said. Not the vault. The safety box I use for deed documents. He looked at his immobilized leg, which I cannot currently access myself. Clara stood up. She looked at Elias. Her face had gone into the mode he recognized, the mode of a person who has just understood the full shape of a situation and is moving directly toward the thing that needs to happen next. The First Territorial Bank in Cheyenne, she said. If Rourke's private records are in that vault, Elias said, and we can get to them before he moves them. Then we have everything, Clara said. Then we have everything, he confirmed. He looked at Willem. The receipt number your father has, will it be enough to access the vault? The vault is registered in Rourke's name, Clara said, thinking aloud. We can't just walk in and open it, no, Elias said. Cross can, with the right authority behind him. He was already turning it over, building it out. If we can get a federal marshal's involvement, based on what we already have Adler's documents, Callahan's testimony, and use that to authorize access to the vault. That takes time, Clara said. Cross has been preparing the ground for weeks, Elias said. He's been in contact with the federal marshal's office in Denver. Closer than you think. Clara looked at her father. Willem was watching both of them with the expression of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and is beginning to understand that it might not be his to carry alone anymore. Get the receipt number from the bank tomorrow morning, Elias said to Clara. I'll send a rider to Cross tonight. The rider went to Laramie that evening, carrying a letter that laid out everything: the wagon incident, Willem's account of Garrett, the receipt number, and the name of the bank. Cross received it 2 days later and sent his own rider directly to Denver. The response from the federal marshal's office came faster than any of them had expected. 4 days. Cross attributed in his return letter to the fact that Rourke's name had apparently already been flagged in connection with a separate land fraud inquiry 2 counties east. The federal machinery had been turning toward Silas Rourke for some time. What they had lacked was a specific documented target. The vault receipt was a specific documented target. Authorization to access the vault in the context of a federal fraud investigation was granted and forwarded to Cross. He was on his way to Cheyenne before the ink was dry. What none of them anticipated was that Rourke had people watching the Cheyenne bank. Elias and Clara rode for Cheyenne on a gray Monday morning, leaving the 2 ranch hands with Margaret and Willem, with instructions that were simple and clear. Nobody came on that property who wasn't expected, and if anything moved that shouldn't move, they sent for the town marshal immediately. The ride to Cheyenne took 2 days. They arrived on a Wednesday and went directly to Cross's hotel, where he was waiting with the authorization papers and the tight expression of a man who had discovered something he hadn't planned for. He knows you're here, Cross said before they'd fully come through the door. Elias looked at him. How? I don't know, Cross said. But a man came to the bank this morning, not to the vault, just to the main floor, and asked one of the clerks whether anyone from out of territory had been inquiring about vault accounts. Clerk didn't tell him anything, but the man sat in the street outside for 2 hours before leaving. Rourke's people, Clara said. Almost certainly, Cross said. Which means he's either been watching the bank as a matter of routine, or someone along the way talked. He looked at the papers on the table. The authorization is legitimate. The marshal assigned to accompany us is meeting us at the bank at 10 tomorrow morning. Everything is in place. He paused. The question is whether Rourke moves tonight. Moves what? Clara said. He can't access his own vault without being seen. He can send someone to the bank with written authorization to remove the contents, Cross said. It would be irregular, but a cooperative bank officer could be convinced to allow it. He looked at Elias. If he removes the contents of that vault tonight, we have Adler's documents and Callahan's testimony and a pattern, but we don't have the evidence that connects Rourke's private instructions to the acts themselves. Can we accelerate? Elias said. Get to the bank tonight. The marshal won't be available tonight, Cross said, and going in without him invalidates the authorization. He looked frustrated, genuinely so. The controlled frustration of a meticulous man confronting a problem that resists method. We go tomorrow morning as planned, at 10. That night, Elias sat by the window of the hotel and watched the street. Not because he expected to see something actionable, because sitting still was not something he was able to do, and watching was at least an action. Clara came and sat across from him around midnight. She'd been trying to sleep. He could tell by her face that she hadn't managed it. They sat in the quiet of the room, with the faint sounds of Cheyenne coming up from the street below, horses, distant voices, the particular nighttime personality of a frontier town that never went fully silent. "What happens if the vault is empty?" she said. "We don't stop," he said. "We have Adler, we have Callahan, we keep building." "It won't be enough without the direct records," she said. Cross said so. Cross said it would be harder, Elias said. "Harder isn't the same thing." She looked at him. "You believe that?" "Yes," he said. He meant it without qualification. She looked down at her hands. "My father is lying in a sick room because of this man," she said quietly. "And Rourke is still—" She stopped. "I know," Elias said. "He's never paid for anything," she said, "in 3 years. Everything he's done, every family he's destroyed, every document he's forged, every building he's burned." Her voice was getting tighter. "He's never once Clara," Elias said. She looked up. "Tomorrow morning," he said. He said it steadily, the way you say something to someone standing on uncertain ground. "One thing at a time. Tomorrow morning," she breathed. Looked at the window. Nodded. They sat until the street outside went quieter, and the night got to that particular deep stillness that comes in the hours before dawn, when everything that is going to happen is still waiting just ahead, and the only thing to do is get to morning. At 10 o'clock the next day, they walked into the First Territorial Bank of Cheyenne with Cross and a federal marshal named Aldridge, who was a compact, deliberate man who had the air of someone who had done difficult things many times and had stopped being surprised by how complicated they got. The bank manager was expecting them. He was not pleased about it, but he had been notified by the federal authority and was not in a position to refuse. He led them to the vault corridor with the stiff courtesy of a man performing a duty he would prefer not to perform. The vault number matched the receipt. The bank manager worked the combination. The door opened. The interior held a metal box, a sealed envelope, and 3 bound ledger books. Cross put on his glasses and opened the first ledger. He read for less than a minute. Then he looked up at Aldridge. "We have everything," he said. But when they turned to leave the vault corridor, 4 men were standing at the far end of the hallway. None of them were bank employees. 2 of them had their coats pulled back just enough to show the handles of their revolvers, and all 4 of them had the particular stillness of men who have been told to stop something from happening and are ready to do what that requires. Marshal Aldridge stepped forward and said clearly, and without raising his voice, "Federal authority. You're interfering with a federal investigation." The 4 men didn't move, and in the long, held moment that followed the documents in Cross's hands, the vault behind them, the 4 men blocking the corridor, Elias Mercer understood what it felt like to have come this far and not yet be through. Then from the bank's main entrance came the sound of boots on marble floor. Several sets of boots moving with purpose, and Marshal Aldridge's deputy appeared at the head of the corridor with 2 additional federal officers behind him. The 4 men looked at the odds. One of them said something low to the others. Then all 4 of them slowly, with the careful movements of people who have recalculated, stepped aside. Cross tucked the ledger under his arm. He looked at Clara. She was breathing hard, though she hadn't moved a step. "Let's go," he said. They walked out of the First Territorial Bank of Cheyenne into the cold November air, with Rourke's private records in hand, and the federal case now resting on something that was no longer a pattern but a proof. And for the first time since October, Elias felt the weight of what they were carrying shift into something that was not quite hope yet, but was the honest thing that comes just before it. Cold outside the bank was sharp and immediate, the kind that finds the gaps in your coat and reminds you that the world doesn't adjust itself to significant moments. Cross walked quickly, the ledger tucked under his arm with both hands holding it as if he expected someone to try taking it again. Marshal Aldridge moved alongside him with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned not to hurry in ways that looked like hurrying, because hurrying invited pursuit. 2 additional officers fell in behind. Elias and Clara came last, and Elias kept his eyes moving the street, the doorways, the roof lines with the habit of a man who had spent the past several weeks learning to read spaces for what they concealed. Nobody followed them out. That was the first thing Elias noted. The 4 men in the corridor had stepped aside and had not reappeared. That was either good judgment on their part or instructions from somewhere telling them the situation had changed. He wasn't certain which, and uncertainty about Rourke's men was not something he intended to treat as reassurance. They went to Aldridge's office, a federal space, which mattered, because federal space had a different quality of safety than a hotel room or a lawyer's office. Cross sat down at the table and opened all 3 ledgers in sequence, spending approximately 4 minutes on each before moving to the next, reading the way lawyers read when they are confirming what they already suspect and are looking for the specific language that makes suspicion into a fact. Clara stood near the window. She had her arms crossed, not in the defensive way, but in the way of someone trying to contain something that was building inside her chest and needed containing for a little while longer. Elias stood near the door. For no reason he could have articulated except that standing near the door had become, over the past several weeks, a way of feeling like he had some control over who came in and went out. Cross finished the 3rd ledger and sat back. 14 named officials, he said. Payment records, going back to 1,873. The bribes are itemized amounts, dates, and in most cases, initials of the recipient, which won't be hard to match to names, given what we already have from Adler. He looked at Aldridge. There are written instructions in Rourke's hand authorizing specific acts. The Hartley fence dispute, the Decker property acquisition. And he paused and looked at Clara directly. A notation about the Voss objection filed in 1,877. He wrote to Fitch in the county office within 24 hours of the filing. The notation says, dispose promptly, no record of receipt. Clara's jaw tightened. She said nothing. The wagon, Elias said. Cross looked down at the 3rd ledger. There is an entry from September of this year, he said carefully. It reads, V situation requires resolution. Instructed H to manage access road. He looked up. H is consistent with a name that appears in 2 other coercion-related entries. The room was quiet. Aldridge looked at the ledger. His face was unreadable, in the way of someone experienced enough to not let professional reaction show in the face, but his eyes had the focused quality of a man assembling a structure that now had all its pieces. This is sufficient for a federal warrant, he said. More than sufficient, he looked at Cross. Can you have a formal statement prepared by tomorrow morning? Tonight, Cross said. Aldridge nodded. He looked at Elias. Where's Rourke now, to your knowledge? His base of operation is in Denver, Elias said. But he's been moving between Colorado and Wyoming for the past 2 months. His men were here this morning, which suggests he's close. We'll have a marshal's team at his Denver office by the end of the week, Aldridge said. And we'll send word to the Colorado Territorial Authority about the Southern Valley properties. He paused. The water rights claims that were filed fraudulently will need to go through a formal reversal process, which takes time. How much time? Clara said. It was the first thing she'd said since they left the bank. Aldridge looked at her. Months, possibly. These things move through federal review at their own pace. He said it without apology, because he was a man who understood that the truth, delivered clearly, was more useful than comfort. Claims will be flagged as under investigation immediately, which means Rourke cannot enforce them or use them as leverage while the review is ongoing. Clara absorbed this. She nodded once. What about the families who already sold, she said. The Hartleys, old Decker. Aldridge was quiet for a moment. That's more complicated, he said. If it can be demonstrated that the sales were made under documented coercion, there are legal remedies. But it requires each family to pursue their own claim. He looked at Cross. It's a civil matter, separate from the criminal proceedings. One thing at a time, Cross said, in the tone of a man who had handled enough cases to know that trying to resolve everything at once was the way to resolve nothing. Clara looked at Elias. He looked back at her. Let's go back to the farm, she said. They rode back the next morning, with copies of the critical documents sealed in Cross's satchel and the originals lodged with Aldridge's office. The federal warrant process was already in motion. Cross had spent until nearly midnight preparing the formal statement and had delivered it Aldridge before dawn. By the time Elias and Clara left Cheyenne, the machinery of federal law was moving toward Silas Rourke with the slow, inevitable weight of something that had been gathering for a long time and had finally found its direction. Should have felt cleaner than it did. Elias watched Clara on the ride back and understood that she was not relieved. Not yet. The documents were secured, the warrant was coming, and her father's account of the wagon accident was now part of a federal record. But Willem Voss was still in a sick room, with a broken leg and internal injuries that the local doctor was still uncertain about. And the farm was still the farm, and Rourke was still somewhere between Denver and Wyoming, with the particular freedom of a man who has not yet been formally stopped. The distance between a warrant being issued and a man being arrested was not a small distance. Elias knew this. Clara knew this better. They arrived at the farm on a Saturday afternoon. Margaret met them at the door with the same composed directness she'd had on their first arrival, But there was something relieved in her eyes when she saw Clara, something that a mother's face does when a child has been somewhere dangerous and is back. Father had a better night, she said. He's been asking about Cheyenne. We got what we went for, Clara said. Margaret looked at her for a long moment, reading something in her daughter's face that was beyond the words. Come inside, she said, both of you. They stayed at the farm for 4 more days, waiting for word from Cross about the warrant. Les slept in the small room off the kitchen that had been Willem's study before the sickroom rearrangement, on a cot that was approximately a foot shorter than he required, which meant he slept with his feet hanging off the end, and woke each morning with a crick in his back that he dealt with by walking the property perimeter before breakfast. It was on one of those morning walks, on the 3rd day, that he found the creek. He'd known it was there, of course the eastern pasture, Clara had said, all those weeks ago in the cookhouse, describing it the way a person describes something so fundamental to the landscape of their life that they can't fully separate it from everything else. But he hadn't gone to look at it until now. He walked across the eastern pasture in the early light, the ground firm and cold underfoot, and came to the bank of a creek that was narrower than he'd imagined and clearer than most water he'd seen, running fast and bright over pale stones in the stillness of the early morning. He stood there for a while. He thought about the fact that this was what it had all been about. This specific water, running through this specific ground, feeding 3 farms that were now reduced to 1. Thought about the weight of what something ordinary could carry when it was the thing between surviving and not. Creek, not remarkable in any scenic sense, just water moving in its particular way, doing what water does. He thought about what Clara had said about the herb garden. It says I intend to be here. I'm planning for next season. This creek said the same thing to the people who depended on it, said there will be a next season. Plan accordingly. He walked back to the farmhouse and told Clara where he'd been, and she looked at him for a moment with an expression he hadn't quite seen from her before, something that was recognition. Like she understood that he'd gone to see something she'd been carrying for years, and had come back having understood it. That's it, she said simply. Yes, he said. She nodded and went back to whatever she was doing, and he understood that the exchange was complete and sufficient. The word from Cross came on the 4th morning. The warrant had been issued. Federal marshals were moving toward Rourke's Denver office. Colorado Territorial Authority had been formally notified, and a local marshal in the Southern Valley, a man named Briggs, who had apparently been waiting for exactly this kind of federal backing for some time, had been authorized to act. What Cross's letter did not mention, because Cross did not know it yet, was that Rourke had been informed of the warrant. Nobody knew how. These things happen. Money had a way of finding its path along the inside of institutions, and a man who had been building a network of bought loyalty for 15 years did not lose that network overnight just because federal paper had been signed. Someone somewhere along the chain from Aldridge's office to Denver had passed word, and Rourke had moved. He did not run. Running, at his level, was not strategically available. It was too visible, and it abandoned too much. What he did instead was what he had always done when cornered. He applied pressure at the point where pressure was most likely to work. The first indication that something was wrong came from one of the ranch hands. Elias had left with Margaret and Willem, a young man named Pruitt, who came riding hard up the farm lane at mid-afternoon on the 4th day, looking like he'd been moving fast for longer than was comfortable. Elias was in the yard when Pruitt came in. Someone's coming, Pruitt said, barely off the horse. From the south road, maybe 8-9 riders, moving deliberate. Elias looked at him. Rourke's men? Don't know who else, Pruitt said. No cattle, no supplies, just riders. Elias went inside. Clara was with her father, and she came out of the sick room when she heard Elias's boots in the hallway. She looked at his face. How many? She said. 8 or 9, he said. On the south road. She was already reaching for her coat. Clara, Elias said. I'm not staying inside, she said. It was not defiance. It was a statement of who she was and what she intended to do with that, and he understood it clearly enough not to argue. Then stay beside me, he said. He went to the main room and spoke to Pruitt and the second ranch hand, a broader, older man named Cord, who had been with the Mercer Ranch for 6 years and had the temperament of someone who didn't get excited about difficult situations because he'd learned that excitement wasn't useful. Elias gave them their positions. Then he went to the porch and waited. Margaret Voss came out and stood beside him without being invited and without asking permission. She had the expression of a woman who had been standing her ground on this property for 30 years and did not intend to stop now because the situation had become more formally dangerous. They heard the riders before they saw them. 8 men came up the farm lane at a walk. Rourke was at the front, which surprised Elias. He'd expected Rourke to stay back, to send his men in while he remained at a comfortable distance. That Rourke had come himself told Elias that this was not a routine pressure visit. This was something Rourke had decided required his personal authority. He looked worse than he had in October. The settled confidence was still there, but underneath it something was strained. A man who has operated from certainty for 15 years and has just learned that certainty is being formally dismantled. Looks like the ground under him is slightly different from what he remembers, and his body knows it before his face admits it. Stopped his horse 20 feet from the porch, Mrs. Voss, he said, looking at Margaret. I'd like to speak with your husband. My husband is not available, Margaret said. Rourke's eyes moved to Clara. Miss Voss. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to the 8 riders behind him, said the rest. There's a federal warrant for your arrest, Mr. Rourke, Elias said. I'd encourage you to be somewhere accessible when the marshals come to serve it. Rourke looked at him. Something shifted in his face, not fear exactly, but the recalibration of a man who is revising his understanding of what he's dealing with. Mr. Mercer, he said, you've gone to considerable trouble over a water dispute that doesn't concern you. Concerns me, Elias said. Does it? Rourke looked at the farmhouse, then at his riders, then back at Elias. I've been operating in this territory for 15 years, he said. I've outlasted 3 sheriffs, 2 federal inquiries, and more lawyers than I can count. He said it without bluster, just as a statement of record. Whatever documents you think you've found, they'll be contested. Whatever witnesses you've assembled will be questioned. These things take years, and during years, circumstances change. What circumstances are you planning on changing? Elias said. Rourke smiled. It was the same smile from October, the one that never reached the eyes. He swung down from his horse and handed his reins to the rider beside him and walked toward the fence line of the property with the deliberate ease of a man who has never been stopped at a fence in his life. Mr. Rourke, Clara said. Her voice cut across the yard clean and clear. That's our fence. He stopped. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is not accustomed to being stopped by a woman's voice. I know exactly what you've done, Clara said. She came down off the porch steps and walked to stand at the fence on her side of it. Forged documents, the bribed officials, the Hartley fence dispute, what you told your man to do to the access road. She looked at him steadily. I know your handwriting now, Mr. Rourke. I've read your ledgers. Your initials, your private instructions. She paused. So has a federal marshal. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. You're very brave for someone standing in front of 9 riders, he said quietly. I know, Clara said. I've been thinking about that. And then from the lane behind Rourke's riders came the sound of hoofbeats. Not 8 horses, more than that. Rourke heard it and turned. His riders heard it and shifted, and the formation behind him became uncertain in the way that formations become when the men in them are revising their assessment of the situation. Coming up the lane were people Elias did not immediately recognize. The first was an older man on a brown horse, heavy-set, with the look of a farmer who had not ridden this hard in some time, and was doing it anyway. Behind him, a woman driving a wagon with 2 men in the bed, one of them holding a shotgun across his knees. Behind them, 3 more riders, then 2 more on foot, walking fast enough that their coats were open despite the cold. The man on the brown horse came around the outside of Rourke's group and stopped his horse at the fence beside Clara. He looked at Rourke. You don't remember me, the man said. He said it evenly without heat. My name is Gerald Oates. You bought my neighbor's water rights in 1876 through a company that doesn't exist. I signed a statement about it last week for a federal marshal named Aldridge. Rourke stared at him. The woman in the wagon said, without getting down, Agnes Hartley. My husband's fence. One of the men behind her said Thomas Callahan. My mother spoke to your lawyer last month. They came one at a time, and each of them said a name and a reason. They were not angry. That was what struck Elias. They were not a mob. They were not shouting. They were not brandishing anything except the shotgun in the wagon bed, which nobody reached for. They were people who had driven and walked and ridden from wherever they were to stand in a farm lane in southern Colorado on a cold afternoon. And they were doing it with the specific dignity of people who had been afraid for a long time and had decided at some point between yesterday and today that they were done being afraid. Rourke's riders had gone very still. Rourke himself had turned back around to face the farmhouse, and he looked at Clara, and he looked at the people filling in behind him. And his face did something that Elias had not expected to see on it. It went uncertain. Not soft, not remorseful, just uncertain, in the way that a structure goes uncertain when you pull the foundational piece, and the rest of it doesn't know yet that it's supposed to fall. This changes nothing legally, Rourke said. His voice had lost some of its evenness. It changes something else, Clara said. Rourke looked at her. You always needed people to be afraid of you, she said. That was the whole system. The bribes only worked because the officials were afraid of what happened if they didn't take them. The land sales only happened because the families were afraid of what happened if they stayed. She looked at the people standing behind him. Look at them. Rourke didn't turn around. They came anyway, Clara said. After everything you did, after years of it, they came anyway. The silence in the farm lane had a particular quality, not empty, but full of something that didn't have a clean name. The sound of something changing. One of Rourke's hired riders said something low to the man beside him. The man beside him looked at the farmers in the lane, at the shotgun in the wagon, at the faces of people who had driven significant distances and were clearly not leaving, and said something back. Two of the riders at the back of the group turned their horses and walked them out of the lane, unhurried, with the neutral expression of men who have decided that whatever they're being paid is not the right amount for whatever this has become. Rourke saw them go. He didn't call them back. 3 more followed. It happened without drama, just men on horses doing the math and deciding the answer didn't add up. By the time Marshal Briggs came up the lane with 3 deputies behind him, carrying the federal warrant that had been wired through from Aldridge's office that morning, Rourke had 4 riders left, and they were standing in a farm lane surrounded on 3 sides by farmers who had nowhere else to be. Briggs was a compact, dry-spoken man who had clearly been waiting to serve this particular warrant for longer than he was going to say out loud. He approached Rourke with the warrant in hand and read the relevant language in a clear voice and said, Silas Rourke, federal warrant for fraud, coercion, land theft, and conspiracy. You're to come with me. Rourke looked at the warrant. He looked at Briggs. He looked at the lane full of people who had refused to run. My lawyers, he started, are welcome to come to Denver, Briggs said. After, the 4 remaining riders looked at each other. One by one, they moved their horses aside. Rourke stood for a moment in the cold afternoon. And for just that moment, his face showed something that was not the confident ease of October or the strained certainty of 20 minutes ago, but something rawer and older, the expression of a man who has built everything on the certainty that other people will eventually step back and has just encountered the specific kind of people who don't. He went with Briggs. He walked to the marshal's horse and mounted the spare that one of the deputies led forward, and Briggs's deputies fell in around him, and the party moved out of the lane and down the south road without looking back. The farm lane was quiet. Then Gerald Oates, the man on the brown horse, let out a long breath and said, to nobody in particular, well, about time. Someone laughed. Not loud, just the release of something that had been held for too long. Then someone else laughed, and the tight quality of the afternoon broke open into something that was not celebration exactly, but was the physical relief of people setting down something heavy. Clara stood at the fence and watched Rourke's party until it was out of sight down the south road. Then she turned around and looked at the people in the lane, the farmer on the brown horse, Agnes Hartley in her wagon, Thomas Callahan and his brothers, the others whose names she was only beginning to match to their faces. She didn't say anything at first. She wasn't the kind of person who had a prepared speech ready for moments like this, and she would not have trusted one if she had. She just looked at them, and they looked back at her, and something passed between the assembled people in that lane that was simpler and more durable than any words available. How did you know to come? She said to Oates. Word gets around, he said. He shifted on his horse. When Briggs started asking questions last week, talking to people, taking statements, we figured something was moving. We figured it had to do with the Voss farm. He looked at her directly. We should have come sooner. You came, Clara said. He looked at the ground. We were scared, he said. For a long time we were scared, and we let that do more than it should have. It does that, Clara said. She wasn't unkind about it. She said it the way someone says something they understand from the inside. Margaret Voss had come down off the porch during the confrontation and was now standing in the lane with the composure of a woman who had been prepared for this moment or a moment like it for 3 years and was experiencing the specific quality of relief that comes from the thing you feared not being as final as you thought it might be. She was looking at the south road, and her hands were still, and her face was the face of someone who was allowing herself, carefully and deliberately, to believe that it was over. Elias stood near the fence gate. He watched Clara move through the people in the lane, shaking a hand here, saying a name there, listening to the fragment of a story that one older woman wanted to tell, even though now was not the time. And the woman clearly couldn't help herself. He watched her do it with the same natural attention she'd brought to the cookhouse, not performed warmth, just genuine presence. Thought about what Rourke had said, You've gone to considerable trouble over a water dispute that doesn't concern you. He looked at Clara in the lane, surrounded by people who had come because they were done being afraid. He thought, no, that's exactly wrong. This is precisely what concerns me. He didn't say it. There was time for things to be said. Right now, the afternoon was doing what it needed to do, and the people in the lane were doing what they needed to do, and Elias Mercer stood at the gate of a Colorado farm that wasn't his and watched the particular thing that happens when fear loses its grip on a community, not all at once, not cleanly, not without cost, and felt something that was not triumph, but was the honest thing that sits adjacent to it. Willem Voss heard everything from the sickroom window. It was not, medically speaking, advisable for him to be sitting upright and craning his neck toward the sound of what was happening in the lane outside. His ribs were still tender, and his leg was a long way from healed, and the doctor had been very specific about limited movement. But Willem Voss had been lying in that sick room for 3 weeks listening to the ordinary sounds of his farm and the less ordinary sounds of the past several days, and when he heard the horses and the voices, he maneuvered himself to the window with the determined stubbornness of a man who has decided that some things are worth the discomfort. He heard Rourke's voice. He heard Clara's voice. He heard Marshal Briggs read the warrant. He heard the sounds of riders leaving, and then of different kinds of people arriving, and then the quiet break of laughter from the lane outside. When Clara came in later and found him sideways in the bed, with the window open an inch, and his face gray with the effort of having sat up, she started to say something pointed about what the doctor had told him. He looked at her and she stopped. "He's gone," she said instead. "I heard," Willem said. She sat on the edge of the bed, the same spot she'd taken when she arrived. He looked at her face for a long moment. "The records," he said. "Everything in those ledgers." "Everything," she said. "The water claims, the forged filings, the payments." "Your objection," she paused. The access road, his jaw worked. He looked at the window for a moment, at the pale November sky outside. "Your mother's going to want to plant the East Garden in spring," he said. His voice was rough. "I know," Clara said. "She's been putting it off." He looked at his hands. She said there wasn't any point until things were settled. He was quiet for a moment. "They're settled now." Clara nodded. "That rancher of yours," Willem said. "He's not," Clara started. Willem looked at her. One eyebrow went up slightly. Stopped. "He rode 300 miles to stand beside you in a bank hallway," Willem said. "Particular kind of not anything." He reached over and took her hand. "Your mother likes him." "Mama likes everyone who comes to the table with good manners," Clara said. Willem said. "She doesn't." He squeezed her hand. "She likes him." Clara looked at the window. "He rebuilt his barn," she said after a while. "Meaning more than the barn." "I know," Willem said. "You told me." Outside, the people in the lane were beginning to disperse, horses moving, wheels turning, voices calling across the cold air in the particular tone of leave-taking that carries relief in it. Farm Lane was becoming ordinary again, the way things become ordinary again, after something large has moved through them, not unchanged, but quiet. Willem Voss lay back in his bed, carefully and with significant effort, and looked at the ceiling of the room he'd been in for 3 weeks. "Spring," he said. He said it the way a man says something he intends to be there for. "We'll have a better spring." Clara sat with him until he slept, which didn't take long because he was still healing, and the afternoon had cost him something. Then she went back out to the yard, where the last of the visiting farmers were heading home down the south road, and the light had gone long and golden over the eastern pasture, and found Elias still standing near the gate. He looked at her. "How is he?" he said. "Talking about spring," she said. Elias looked out at the pasture. The creek wasn't visible from here. It was down in the low ground beyond the tree line, but you could hear it if you listened, which Elias did for a moment. "We should start back to Wyoming in the morning," he said. "The ranch has been without both of us for long enough." "Yes," Clara said. She stood beside him at the gate, and they looked at the farm that was going to get its spring, and the pasture that was going to keep its water, and the East Garden that Margaret Voss was going to plant when the ground came back from winter, and neither of them spoke for a while. It was enough for now to be standing in the same place. The hard part was not over. The legal process would run for months. The fraud case would be contested and documented and argued in federal court, and Rourke's lawyers would do exactly what Rourke had predicted they would do, which was question everything and extend everything, and find every procedural foothold available to a well-funded defense. That was all coming, and they both knew it, but Rourke was in federal custody. His private ledgers were in federal hands. People of the Southern Valley had stood in a farm lane on a cold afternoon and refused to run, and that refusal was now part of the record of what had happened here. And records, as Clara had learned and Elias had confirmed, were not nothing. They were, in fact, sometimes everything Tomorrow they would ride north, back to Wyoming, back to the rebuilt barn, and the men who ate at 3 long tables and a herb garden that would need turning in spring. Back to the ranch that had become, over the course of an autumn that none of them had expected, something different from what it had been before. Not finished, not resolved into anything clean, but different, in the way that things are different when they've been tested and have held. The evening settled over the Colorado farm, and the creek kept moving through the eastern pasture, and the light went the way light goes at the end of a long day, reluctantly, and then all at once. They rode north into a headwind. It was the kind of wind that comes off the high ground in early December, with nothing personal against you, but no particular interest in making things comfortable either. It found the gaps in collars and pushed against the horses' chests and made the miles feel longer than the miles were. Elias rode with his hat pulled low and his coat buttoned to the throat. Clara rode beside him with her chin down and her eyes forward, and the expression of someone who has learned that weather, like most things, passes faster if you don't spend energy arguing with it. They didn't talk much for the first 2 days, not from tension from the particular quiet of people who have been through something large together and are still in the process of absorbing it. The 2 ranch hands, Pruitt and Cord, rode ahead and behind, giving them the privacy of distance without making a point of it. On the second evening, they made camp in the lee of a sandstone outcrop that broke the wind enough to get a fire going. Clara cooked trail food, nothing remarkable but seasoned and timed with the automatic competence of someone who knew what she was doing and did it without needing to think about it. Elias watched her do it and felt again the thing he'd been feeling, with increasing regularity since October, and increasing clarity since the farm lane in Colorado. The question he hadn't asked her yet was becoming unreasonable to keep not asking. He didn't ask it that night. The timing felt wrong. They were tired and cold, and the fire was small, and there was something the moment that required something better than a cold night on the trail. He filed it. He was patient by nature and by practice. He'd built a 400-acre ranch one season at a time. He could wait for the right moment. Clara, for her part, was doing her own version of the same thing, feeling the weight of a question she hadn't been asked and wasn't sure what her answer would be, and not pushing on it, because pushing on things before they were ready had never, in her experience, made them come out better. She was thinking about the farm, about her mother's face when the riders left the lane, about her father saying spring as if it were a place he was planning to travel to, deliberate and unhurried. She was thinking about what it meant to have spent 4 months building something in Wyoming, not just the cookhouse, not just the food, but the particular thing that happens when you put real effort into a place and the place starts to hold it. She was thinking, though she didn't say this to anyone, about the herb garden. She had planted it in October with the confidence of someone who intended to see it in spring. That confidence had not been dishonest. She had not planted it as a performance of permanence. She had planted it because she meant it. She still meant it. They reached the Mercer Ranch on a Friday afternoon, 4 days out of Colorado. The gate was intact, the new barn frame, visible from the lane-pale wood darkening slowly in the weather, the smell of cut lumber still faintly present when the wind shifted. Holt Greer was in the yard when they rode in, and he looked at them both with the measured expression of a man who has managed 17 days of questions from 23 other men, and is relieved to have the people with answers back on the property. "Everything's standing," he said. "Good," Elias said. "Cattle are fine. Supply order came in Tuesday. Mason wants to talk to you about the main barn roof when you have time." Holt looked at Clara. "Men have been eating their own cooking since you left. There's been some suffering. I'll start supper in an hour," Clara said. Holt nodded with the restraint of a man who was genuinely grateful and was expressing it at 1/10 volume. She went to the cookhouse. He went to the main house. And the ranch, which had been running in their absence the way a clock runs, without anyone watching it mechanically, correctly, but without the human quality that makes a place feel inhabited, settled back into itself with the particular ease of a thing returning to its natural state. The legal case moved the way Cross had said it would, slowly, and then faster than expected, and then in ways that nobody had fully predicted. Federal fraud proceedings against Silas Rourke were formally opened in Denver in January of 1879. The 3 ledgers from the Cheyenne Vault, combined with Adler's duplicate documents and the depositions from Bertie Kim Callahan and 6 additional witnesses, 3 of whom came forward in the weeks after Rourke's arrest, apparently having been waiting to see which direction the current was going, before committing to swimming in it, constituted what the presiding federal judge described, in language Cross quoted verbatim in his letter to Elias, as an unusually complete evidentiary record. Fitch, the former county recorder, who had processed Rourke's fraudulent filings and was currently practicing law in Denver, was indicted separately in February. He cooperated almost immediately, which Cross said was the behavior of a man who had been anticipating this moment for years and had decided that cooperation was preferable to solidarity with someone who had never shown him any. Rourke's lawyers did exactly what Rourke had predicted. They questioned, they extended, they found procedural footholds, and worked them with the competence of people paid significant amounts to be obstacles. The trial ran for 11 weeks. It was not clean. Nothing about it was clean. There were days when the evidentiary chain seemed to wobble under cross-examination, days when Adler was on the stand being questioned about his own involvement in the fraudulent filings, and the distinction between coercion and complicity became uncomfortably thin. There were days when Cross's letters to Elias had the flat, careful tone of someone reporting difficulty without catastrophizing it, and Elias learned to read those letters the way he read weather, for what was between the stated words as much as what was in them. Clara read every letter. She sat at the work table in the cookhouse with the letters flat in front of her and read them with the same focused attention she brought to supply ledgers, and when she had read them, she would set them down and go back to whatever she'd been doing. She would not discuss them unless Elias brought them up first. He understood this as the behavior of someone managing a specific kind of fear by keeping it contained, and he respected the management of it even when he wanted to reach into the containment and deal with whatever was in there more directly. In March, Rourke was convicted on 11 counts of fraud, 2 counts of coercion, 1 count of conspiracy to commit property damage to the barn, and 2 additional counts related to the Access Road incident that had put Willem Voss in a sick room. The sentencing was scheduled for April. Cross's letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Clara was at the cookhouse. Elias brought it to her there because it felt wrong to read it anywhere else. She read it standing at the work table. When she finished, she set it down. She looked at the window, the south-facing window above the herb garden, which was still dormant in the March cold, but had begun to show, if you looked closely, the first faint suggestion of returning green at the base of the sage. 11 counts, she said. 11, Elias said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the letter and read one section again, silently, and set it down. The water claims are being reversed, she said. Cross says the formal process takes another 4 months, but the preliminary ruling is in. Yes, my family's water rights are protected, she said. She said it as if she were confirming something she needed to hear in her own voice. Parents can plant the east garden. Your mother, Elias said, has probably already started. Something shifted in Clara's face. Not dramatic, just a loosening of something that had been held tight for a very long time. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was related to one, and she turned and went back to the stove, because the pot needed attention. And Elias stood in the cookhouse that smelled like wood smoke and rendered fat, and something indefinably like home, and watched her turn back to the work, and understood that this was not nothing. This was, in fact, everything that mattered about the past 6 months, distilled into a woman with a wooden spoon and a pot that needed attention and a family who was going to get their spring. April came to Wyoming with the particular stubbornness of a season that knows it's waited long enough. The ground came back from the frost. The pastures went from brown to green in the space of 2 weeks, one of those rapid transitions that always felt slightly improbable, no matter how many years you'd watched it happen. The new barn was finished in the first week of April, fully sided, roofed, equipped, and stocked, and on the morning it was formally put into use. Holt walked through it without saying anything, which was the highest form of approval available from him. Herb garden came back. It came back imperfectly. The way things come back from winter in honest soil, the rosemary took, the sage took, the thyme came up in the wrong location and would need relocating. The parsley that she'd planted optimistically in November did not survive and would need replanting in late spring. Clara assessed the situation on a Tuesday morning in early April, with her notebook and her hand trowel and the brisk practicality of someone who understood that gardens, like most things, required adjustment between the plan and the reality. The young ranch hand with the sunburned neck, whose name was Eddie Marsh, and who had been on the Mercer property for 2 years and had, by imperceptible degrees, become something like the informal spokesperson for the mood of the bunkhouse, came around the corner of the cookhouse while she was working the soil and stood watching her for a moment. Parsley didn't make it, Clara said without looking up. No, Eddie said, I noticed. He watched her work for a moment. Miss Voss, Eddie. The men wanted me to say something, he said. He was doing the thing young men do when delivering a message that requires sincerity, which is to direct their gaze at the middle distance and deliver it to the air rather than to the specific person, as if the air is less demanding. About the past few months, while you were away. You managed, Clara said. We made terrible food, he said. You managed, she repeated, in the same tone, which meant she understood both the literal and the implied content. We're glad you're back, he said. He said it simply, and then looked away and waited. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at the garden, and at the south wall of the cookhouse, and at the pale spring sky above the ridgeline. So am I, she said. It was the most direct answer she'd given to that question in the 6 months since she'd arrived, and she was aware of that, and it was deliberate. Eddie Marsh went back to his work. Clara went back to the garden. Elias found her there that evening. The supper had been served, and the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and the cookhouse was cleaned, and the fire banked, and Clara had come back outside in the cooling evening with her coat on and her sleeves rolled down. And she was sitting on the low wooden bench she'd installed beside the south wall, in October, the one that got afternoon sun, looking at what the herb garden had decided to do and what it hadn't. Elias came around the corner of the cookhouse the way he'd been coming around that particular corner since November deliberately, and with the clear intention of arriving at the same place she was. He sat down on the other end of the bench. They sat for a while looking at the garden. Time is in the wrong spot, Clara said. How wrong? Wrong enough to move, she said. It'll shade the rosemary by July if it stays where it is. Can you move it without killing it? Probably, she said. Time's resilient. It doesn't require perfect conditions. It just requires someone paying attention. He looked at the garden. He thought about paying attention. He thought about the past 6 months, every morning at the work table, every letter from Cross, every conversation about things that were urgent, and things that were less urgent, and things that mattered in ways that were hard to articulate, but were as real as the soil in the garden in front of them. Clara, he said. She looked at him. He had thought about this conversation. He was not by nature an unplanned man. He'd considered the words and the timing and the way to say the thing he needed to say with enough honesty that it didn't come out as something smaller than it was. He had thought about it with the same careful attention he brought to supply ledgers and winter planning and the assessment of structural problems in chimneys. All of that dissolved the moment she looked at him, because the look on her face, attentive, waiting, already knowing what was coming and watching to see how he would handle the getting there, undid every preparation he'd made. So he said it plainly. I don't want you to stay, because the ranch needs a cook, he said. I need you to know that first. Whatever the ranch needs is a separate question. I want you to stay because I stopped. Try it again. Because in 20 years of building this place, you are the first person who has made it feel like it was worth building. Not the land, not the cattle, not the money. He looked at her directly. Clara was quiet. I'm aware that I'm not easy to know, he said. I'm aware that I tend to manage things from a distance, and I don't always say the thing I'm thinking at the moment I'm thinking it, and I make decisions that affect other people, and don't always inform them in advance. He paused. You've told me about the last one. I'm working on it. Something shifted in her face. I'm not a simple proposition, she said. My family is in Colorado. The legal case is going to continue to require attention for months. I have opinions about most things, and I'll tell you what they are, whether or not you've asked. She looked at the garden. And I will always plant gardens in places where other people see dirt. I know, he said. You know, she said, I've been watching you do it for 6 months, he said. It's not a warning. It's part of the proposition. She looked at him for a long moment. The particular examining look she used when she was deciding whether something was as true as it sounded, or whether it was true in the easier sense that people mean when they haven't been tested on the point yet. She must have decided it was the first kind, because she turned back to the garden and said, in the voice she used when something was settled, the time needs to go there. She pointed to the far left of the bed. Against the wall. It'll get afternoon sun without blocking anything. Elias looked where she was pointing. All right, he said. And I want a larger bed next season, she said. The current dimensions are insufficient for what this kitchen actually needs. Tell me what you need, and I'll have the soil turned before June. She nodded. She looked at the garden, then she looked at him. Ask me properly, she said. He looked at her. You know what I mean, she said. Not coy, just factual. He did know. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He had not been entirely unplanned, after all. There was something there. A small thing. Something he'd ridden to Laramie for on a Wednesday in March when Clara thought he'd gone for supply business, and he'd gone for something else entirely. He held it out. It was a ring not elaborate, not theatrical, a plain gold band with a small setting of turquoise, the color of the Wyoming sky on a clear day between the passes. He'd chosen it himself without asking anyone's advice, which was characteristic of him, and which he suspected she would recognize as such. Clara looked at the ring. She looked at his face. "Elias Mercer," she said. "Clara Voss," he said. "Will you stay?" She took the ring from his hand, looked at it for a moment in the failing light, looked at the garden, looked at the ridgeline above the ranch, which was going gold and copper in the evening, in the way that Wyoming ridgelines do before they go dark, always dramatic about it, never apologetic. "I am home," she said. She said it quietly, and with the full weight of someone who has spent a significant portion of their life uncertain where that word applied to them and has just determined its location. Then she held out her hand. He put the ring on. It didn't go on perfectly smoothly. Her fingers were cold from the evening air, and it stuck briefly at the knuckle, and she laughed, a short, surprised sound, and he persisted without drama, and it went on. Not perfect, real. They sat on the bench beside the herb garden in the evening air and didn't say much else for a while, because the moment didn't require amplification. The wedding was in June. It was not a large production. Elias had offered large, and Clara had declined it in the same direct way. She declined most things she didn't want clearly, without extended explanation. What happened instead was something that emerged organically from the specific community that had assembled itself around the events of the previous autumn and winter, which meant it was larger than Clara had planned, and more varied than Elias had expected, and considerably more alive than either of them could have engineered. Cross came from Laramie with his wife, a small, sharp-eyed woman who assessed the ranch in her first 20 minutes, and told Clara she'd made good choices with the kitchen, which was the highest compliment Clara received that day, and the one she valued most. Holt Greer stood up as the closest thing Elias had to family, because he was 11 years of shared work on shared ground, makes its own kind of kinship that doesn't require blood. Eddie Marsh, who had been told he could attend the ceremony, but was not obligated to stay for the dinner and had stayed anyway, spent most of the afternoon in conversation with Cross about something legal that neither of them would explain when asked. From Colorado came Gerald Oates and his wife, who brought preserves and a piece of advice that Clara's mother had sent along. Keep the garden between you. It gives you something to argue about that matters less than the things that matter. Agnes Hartley came with 2 of her sons. Thomas Callahan came alone, quiet and smiling, in the particular way of someone who has recently set something heavy down and is still getting used to the lightness. Margaret Voss came. She walked through the ranch with the same assessing eyes she'd turned on Elias in November, and found, apparently, that her assessment had not changed in the intervening months. She told Elias on the morning of the wedding that he had a good piece of land and had managed it without ruining it, which from Margaret Voss was a form of endorsement. Willem Voss came. He came on a horse which the doctor had said was inadvisable, and which Willem had accepted as information rather than instruction. He rode from Colorado over 3 days, with one of his neighbors alongside him, and he arrived at the Mercer Ranch on the morning of the ceremony, looking like a man who had done something difficult and intended to act as if he hadn't. His leg was healed well enough for light riding, not perfectly. There was a hitch in his movement that was going to be permanent, but he was upright and present, and when Clara came out of the main house and saw him standing in the yard, she walked to him fast, the way she moved when she forgot to manage herself, and he held on to her for a long time without saying anything. The ceremony was held in the yard, in the afternoon, with the new barn visible behind the assembled guests, and the herb garden at the south wall of the cookhouse beyond them. Well into its spring growth, the thyme relocated successfully. The rosemary, full and dark green new parsley established and thriving. The sage had exceeded all expectations and would need cutting back by July, which was the kind of problem Clara was happy to have. A justice of the peace from Laramie performed the ceremony with the professional warmth of a man who had married enough couples to understand that the ritual itself was almost beside the point, and the thing that mattered was the 2 people in front of him, and whether they were paying attention to each other. They were. Elias stood in the Wyoming afternoon light and looked at Clara Voss, who was standing in front of him in a dress that was practical and not elaborate, and that she had clearly chosen with exactly as much attention to appearance as she considered appropriate, and not 1 degree more. And he thought about October, and the woman who had walked into his cookhouse with a notebook and a hand trowel, and a complete willingness to tell him what she thought. He thought about the burned barn, and the 4 days' ride south, and the bank hallway in Cheyenne, and the farm lane in Colorado, and the cold bench beside the herb garden in April. Thought about the fact that he had spent 11 years building a fortune on this ground, and had not until 6 months ago understood the difference between a property and a home. The justice spoke the words. They spoke theirs. Clara's voice was steady and direct, the way it always was when she meant something completely. Elias's voice was quieter, which was characteristic of him, and which she had long ago identified as the register he used for things that mattered most. Holt Greer, standing slightly to one side, kept his expression at its usual neutral and did not visibly react to anything. Later, around the supper table, Eddie Marsh would report that he had seen Holt's jaw work once during the vows, in the manner of a man suppressing something he didn't intend to let out in public, but this was never confirmed, and Holt denied it without particular emphasis. The supper went until the stars came out. It was the kind of gathering that builds its own momentum. Once the formal part is over, tables pulled together, food passed without ceremony, conversations starting and crossing, and going in directions nobody had planned. Elias sat at the head of the long table that had been assembled from the cookhouse. Tables moved into the yard and watched the particular thing happen that he'd watched in smaller versions all winter. People eating real food together and talking to each other like it mattered. Willem Voss sat to his left. They talked for a long time not about Rourke, not about the legal case, but about land, about cattle and water and what it cost to build something from open ground and what it cost to keep it. Willem had a rancher's instinct for this kind of conversation, the kind that can run through the whole evening and not feel like it's going anywhere, because it isn't trying to go anywhere. It's just two men talking about the thing they both understand from the inside. At some point, Willem said, without looking up from his plate, "She'll make this place something." Elias looked down the table to where Clara was deep in conversation with Margaret and Cross's wife about something that appeared to involve significant opinions on all three sides. "She already has," he said. Willem nodded once, as if this confirmed something he'd already decided. In the months that followed, the Mercer Ranch did what ranches do. It worked. Not smoothly, there were bad weeks, supply problems, a late cold snap in May that cost them some early calving, a dispute with a neighboring property about a shared fence line that took 3 months to resolve and required Elias to call on his patience reserves more than once. Holt managed the daily operations with the same steady efficiency that had always made him indispensable, and the men worked with the quality of people who expected the work to be worth something. The cookhouse remained what Clara had made it, the warmest room on the property, not in terms of temperature but in the other sense, the harder to measure one. Men came in for meals and came out different, in the way that a good meal in a well-managed room does something to a person's sense of the day. It was not dramatic. It was consistent, and consistency, as Clara had always understood, is a thing that actually built anything worth having. She sent monthly letters to her parents. Her mother wrote back with the length of someone who had been waiting for a reliable correspondent, filling pages with garden news and valley news, and the kind of detailed domestic accounting that only makes sense between people who share a specific understanding of what daily life actually contains. Her father wrote shorter letters, practical and direct, with the occasional observation buried inside the practical that was worth more than most people's longer efforts. In August, the federal court in Denver handed down Rourke's sentencing, 12 years in federal prison, with a fine that, after the legal proceedings, stripped away the layers of shell companies and recovered what could be recovered, went partially toward restitution for the families who had lost property under fraudulent claims. It was not full restitution. The Hartleys did not get their sheep operation back. Old Decker did not come back from Denver. Some of what was lost in the ways that things are lost permanently, and the legal process acknowledged this and could not fix it and filed it accordingly. What the reversal of the water rights did was restore something more fundamental, the possibility of the future. The Voss farm had its creek. The land in the southern valley that had been shadowed by Rourke's fraudulent claims was freed from that shadow. The families who had stayed, the ones who had driven and ridden to a farm lane in November and stood in the cold because they were done being afraid, had their footing back. That was not nothing. In a territory where footing was the difference between everything and nothing, it was very close to everything. Cross wrote to Elias in September with the final accounting of the case, a letter that ran to 4 pages because Cross was thorough even when thoroughness exceeded what was strictly necessary. He ended the letter with a single sentence that Elias read twice and then handed to Clara because it seemed like the kind of sentence that deserved more than one reader. In 20 years of practice, I have rarely seen a case where the evidence was assembled through such a combination of preparation and simple refusal to be persuaded that the situation was permanent. Clara read it, handed it back. "Simple refusal," she said. "As if that's the easy part." "It's the hardest part," Elias said. "Yes," she said, "it is. The herb garden, by September, had established itself with the confidence of something that intends to stay. The rose was substantial. The sage had been cut back twice and was thriving for it. The thyme in its relocated position had settled into the afternoon sun, as if it had always been there. Clara added a row of lavender in August that she wasn't entirely certain would manage the Wyoming elevation, but intended to find out, which was consistent with her general approach to most things. On a Tuesday evening in late September, she was working the edge of the bed when Elias came around the corner of the cookhouse. He stopped, because she was talking to the lavender, quietly but distinctly, in the way of a person who has decided that plants respond to attention in whatever form it takes. He leaned against the corner of the building and watched her for a moment without announcing himself. She felt him there, she usually did, by now, and said, without turning, "It's going to take." "You don't know that," he said. "I know it," she said. She sat back and looked at the row of lavender with the expression of someone who has made a decision and is confident in the making of it. Things take when they're in the right place, and someone's paying attention. Came and sat on the bench. The evening light was doing what Wyoming evening light does, in September going amber and long, the shadows stretching across the yard toward the new barn, the ridgeline cutting a clean line against the sky. Kind of evening that looked like an argument for staying somewhere. "Holt told me today that Eddie Marsh wants to learn the supply ledger system," Elias said. "Good," Clara said. "He's ready for it. He also said the men are talking about winter, whether to lay in more provisions than last year." He paused. "Apparently, last year's provisions were insufficient." "Last year's provisions were fine," Clara said. "What was insufficient was the cooking that was done with them." She looked at him. "Did you tell him that?" "I told him to talk to you." "Sensible," she said. He looked at the garden. At the ranch yard beyond it, where the ordinary machinery of the evening was turning horses being seen to, the bunkhouse lights coming on, the particular sound of 23 men winding down a working day and getting ready for supper. He thought about what it had cost to get here. Not in money. Money was a tool, and tools had their specific use, and he had no sentimentality about tools. Thought about the cost in the other currency, the burned barn and the cold ride south, and the 4 men in a bank corridor, and the November afternoon in a farm lane where fear had been told, collectively and without drama, that its time was up. He thought about what you find out about yourself when someone shows you what you've been missing. He had thought for 11 years that the ranch was what he'd built. He understood now that the ranch had always been incomplete, not because it lacked anything material, but because he had filled it with everything money could provide, and had not understood that the thing he'd left out was not a thing at all. It was a person who came in with a notebook and a hand trowel, and the complete willingness to see what was true rather than what was convenient, and to say so plainly. He had bought labor and materials and professional services and livestock and land and equipment for 11 years, and none of it had been worth what the last 12 months had cost him, and returned to him in a form he hadn't expected. There is a thing that people with significant resources sometimes fail to understand, and it is this. Money is extraordinarily useful for a specific category of problems, and it is completely useless for another category. And the second category tends to contain the things that actually matter. Elias had known this in the abstract. For years, he was not an unintelligent man. But abstract knowledge and understood knowledge are not the same thing. And what Clara had done, by being exactly who she was in the specific place and time that she appeared, was convert his abstract knowledge into the understood kind. He could not have told you when it happened. That was the honest answer. It had not happened in a moment. It had happened the way the herb garden had happened, through repeated small attention, through showing up, through someone making a decision to take a piece of ground that didn't look like much and working it until it was something. "I want to tell you something," he said. Clara looked at him. The last light was in her face. "I know who I was before you came here," he said. "I was a man who had everything and managed it well and was not by any honest measure happy. Not unhappy, I don't want to be dramatic about it. Just not all the way present in the thing I'd built." He looked at the garden. "You walked into my cookhouse in October, and within 3 weeks, every man on this property was sitting up straighter. Not because you were remarkable, though you are, but because you cared about the thing you were doing and the people it affected. Cared genuinely, and people can feel the difference." Clara was quiet. "I don't take it for granted," he said. "I want you to know that, any of it." She looked at the garden for a moment. Then she looked at him. "I came to Wyoming looking for a job," she said. "I came because I needed the wages and I needed the distance, and I needed to be somewhere that Rourke wasn't looking." She paused. "I didn't come looking for anything else." "I know," he said. "What I found." She stopped. She was not sentimental by nature, and she resisted anything that felt like a prepared speech. And he could see her working out how to say something true without making it larger than it was or smaller than it was. What I found was a place that needed what I was capable of giving, she said, and a person who was willing to see that clearly and act accordingly. She looked at him. That's rarer than most people think. It was not a declaration in the lyrical sense, but it was the honest truth stated by an honest person, and it weighed more than lyric. He reached over and took her hand. She let him. They sat on the bench beside the herb garden as the September evening went from gold to copper to the deep blue that comes just before dark, and the ranch settled into its night rhythms around them. And the lavender, she was not entirely certain, would survive. The Wyoming winter stood in its row against the south wall, with the specific stubbornness of something that has decided to try. Thought about what she had told him in October about gardens. It says, I intend to be here. I'm planning for next season. She was planning for next season, and the one after that. Here's what this story is. In the end, stripped of its particulars, it is about what happens when a person stops confusing what they own with what they have. Elias Mercer had owned a great deal for a long time and had not had very much, in the sense that matters. Clara Voss had owned almost nothing and had known exactly what she had, which was herself, her competence, her honesty, her particular refusal to be less than she was in order to make someone else more comfortable. She had walked into his ranch with a trunk and a notebook, and that refusal, and what she had left with was a life. What she had given him was the same. The ranch prospered, not in a way that was remarkable, not in a way that made headlines or changed the territory's history, but in the way that real things prosper steadily, setbacks and adjustments and seasons that were harder than expected, and within that steadiness, something durable. The men who worked there stayed. New ones came and stayed too. Cookhouse remained the center of the place, the room where the day began and ended properly, where the weather was discussed, and the arguments were started and occasionally resolved, and the basic human transaction of eating together was conducted with the seriousness it deserved. Herb Garden survived the winter. The lavender was touch and go until March, and then came through with a determination that Clara accepted as confirmation of what she'd told Elias in September. She told the lavender it had done well, in approximately the same tone she used for Eddie Marsh when he got the supply ledger right on the first try. Willem Voss's leg healed imperfectly and completely, which is how these things heal when they heal at all. The hitch in his walk remained, but did not prevent him from working his land. And the east garden that Margaret planted in April was by July the most productive it had been in 3 years, which Margaret attributed to the new fertilization approach she'd implemented, and everyone else attributed to the fact that the shadow of Silas Rourke was no longer over the ground. In the frontier, in the years when the American West was still in the process of deciding what it was going to be, survival was a daily proposition. People who lasted were not always the strongest or the wealthiest or the most forceful. People who lasted were the ones who understood what they were building and why they were building it and who they were building it with and for. People who lasted were the ones who could look at a piece of difficult ground and see not what it was but what it was possible to make of it, and who were willing to do the work without being promised the outcome. Clara Voss had always known this. She had known it in farmhouses and hotel kitchens, and on cold trail camps and in cookhouses that needed scrubbing. She had known it the way you know things that were never taught to you formally, but were simply part of what you were made of. What she taught Elias Mercer was not anything he couldn't have figured out eventually on his own. But eventually on his own might have taken another decade, and what she gave him was the shorter path, the one that runs directly through the center of what matters and doesn't allow you to go around it. His greatest possession had never been the land, or the cattle, or the 412 acres that ran from the northern pasture to the eastern creek and south to the canyon wall. It was this, a Tuesday evening in late September, the last light going amber over the ridgeline, the herb garden in its imperfect and persistent growth along the south wall, and the woman beside him on the bench who had walked in one October morning expecting only a job and had stayed because she had found something better, not easier, not simpler, not without cost, better. And in the unforgiving frontier, where the wind came off the high ground with nothing personal against you, and the seasons did not adjust themselves to significant moments, and survival was a proposition that had to be renewed every single day, that was the only thing worth calling by its real name, which was not luck, and not fortune, and not the particular favor of circumstances. It was love the working kind, the kind that shows up and scrubs the pans and plants the garden, and rides 300 miles into difficult territory and stands at the fence and refuses, When it matters most, to step back. The kind that stays,